The shotgun barrel pressed so hard against Talia Monroe's sternum that she could feel the cold metal through her uniform. The man holding it, shaking hands, wild eyes, sweat pouring down his temple, screamed for everyone to get on the ground. Customers scrambled, dishes shattered. A woman cried out somewhere near the window booth. Talia didn't move. She stood behind that diner counter at 2:15 in the morning, flour still on her apron from the pie she'd been cutting, and she looked at him. Not with fear, not with anger. She studied him the way a doctor studies a patient who doesn't yet know how sick they are. And then, slowly, impossibly, she smiled. If you've ever wondered what separates the people who survive impossible moments from the ones who fall apart, stay with me. Because what happened next didn't just save lives. It changed everything. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. The night shift at Milo's Diner had a rhythm to it that Talia Monroe knew in her bones. By midnight, the last of the dinner crowd would be gone. The couples who'd come in after the theater, the construction workers who ate like they were still working, the regulars who ordered the same thing every single time and got upset if the coffee was half a degree too cold. By 1 a.m., it was just the insomniacs, the drunks sobering up before they drove home, and the people who didn't have anywhere else to go. By 2 a.m., the place was almost always empty, and Talia would start the slow work of restocking the condiments, wiping down the counter, and waiting for the clock to reach 6 so she could hand the keys to Danny, the morning manager who always smelled like he'd already been smoking for 2 hours before he arrived. It wasn't a glamorous life. She knew that. She'd known it since she was 19 when she'd taken the job as a temporary thing, just until she figured out what she actually wanted to do with herself. And then temporary had quietly become 5 years without her noticing. She was 24 now. She had a studio apartment 12 blocks west that she split the rent on with her cat, a one-eyed tabby named Sargent, and she had exactly $240 in her savings account after paying last month's electric bill. But she also had the ability to read a room the way other people read weather. It wasn't something she'd cultivated deliberately. It was just there, like a low hum underneath everything she experienced. She noticed things. The way the drunk at table 7 was gripping his coffee cup with both hands, because he was embarrassed, not cold. The way the woman in the corner booth had reapplied her lipstick twice in an hour, which meant she was waiting for someone who probably wasn't going to show. The way the cook, Marco, got quiet when the orders piled up. Not because he was stressed, but because concentration was his version of calm, and interrupting it made him sloppy. Small things. Human things. Talia collected them the way other people collected receipts. At 2:09 that Tuesday night, the diner had 4 customers. An elderly man named Gene, who came in every Tuesday and always ordered decaf and apple pie. 2 college kids sharing a plate of fries near the jukebox. And a woman in her 40s sitting alone at the counter, nursing black coffee and staring at her phone screen with the particular stillness of someone who had received bad news and hadn't decided yet how to respond to it. Talia was behind the counter slicing the last piece of pie for Jean when she heard the bell above the door. She didn't look up right away. The bell meant a customer, and customers at this hour meant someone who needed something warm and somewhere quiet. She finished cutting the slice cleanly, set the knife down, and then lifted her eyes. 3 men. The first thing she registered was that they were wearing gloves. July in Chicago, 2 a.m., and all 3 of them had gloves on. Her brain filed that detail before she'd even fully processed their faces. The second thing she registered was the way they fanned out the moment they crossed the threshold, not wandering in like customers, but spreading deliberately, one toward the door, one angling left toward the booths, and the third moving straight toward the counter with a long-barreled shotgun already rising from his side. Everything happened in a compressed second that felt stretched thin. The man with the shotgun, he was maybe 22, 23, wearing a gray hoodie with the drawstring pulled tight around his face, slammed the barrel down on the counter in front of Talia with a sound like a thunderclap. Jean flinched so hard his coffee cup rattled off its saucer. The college kids scrambled out of their chairs. The woman at the counter sucked in a breath and went rigid. "Register," the young man's voice cracked on the word. "Open it, now." Talia didn't move. Not because she was being brave. Not because she'd decided to be a hero. It was more involuntary than that. Like the part of her brain responsible for panic had simply failed to fire, and instead the observational part had kicked into overdrive, taking inventory with cold and clinical efficiency. His hands were trembling, not slightly, genuinely shaking, the barrel of the gun vibrating with the tremor in his wrists. His jaw was set hard, the way people set their jaws when they're trying to hold themselves together and not quite managing it. He was terrified. More terrified, she realized, than any of the people he was currently threatening. "Okay," she said. Her voice came out even. She was mildly surprised by that. "I'm going to open the register. I just need you to move the gun back a little so I can reach the button underneath." He blinked. Whatever response he'd prepared for, it wasn't that. "What?" "The release button for the register drawer is down here." She gestured below the counter without reaching for it. "I can't hit it if you're in the way. I'm not trying to do anything except give you what you're asking for." He stared at her for a long moment. 3 seconds, 4, 5, and then he shifted back maybe 6 inches. Just enough. That's when Talia started actually thinking. The man by the door, she clocked him in her peripheral vision, was watching the street outside, not the room. He was keeping watch, which meant he was the practical one, the planner, possibly the one who'd organized this. His body language was controlled. He wasn't afraid. That made him the most dangerous person in the building. The third man, the one who'd gone left toward the booths, had herded Jean and the college kids into the corner by the jukebox. He was talking, low, fast, telling them to keep their heads down, but his eyes kept going to the one with the shotgun. He was waiting for something, instructions maybe, or a signal. "Follow her," she thought. "Does what he's told." She opened the register drawer. $212 in small bills plus the roll of quarters she used for the jukebox. "Take it." She stepped back and kept her hands visible. "That's everything. It's yours." The young man with the shotgun reached forward and grabbed the bills with one hand, stuffing them into his jacket pocket without counting them. His eyes were moving too fast, ceiling, door, her face, Jean, the college kids, her face again. He was checking too many things at once because he hadn't accounted for how overwhelming this would feel. "Watches," he said suddenly. "Phones. Wallets. Everybody." And this was where Talia understood the situation had shifted into something more dangerous. They'd come for the register. That was the plan. Fast in, cash out, gone before anyone could think to call the police. But now he was improvising, which meant the plan wasn't holding, which meant the controlled part of this robbery, such as it was starting to dissolve. Improvisation, in her experience, was where things went wrong. She had a choice. She could let it continue and hope the man by the door reined his partner in. Or she could do something she'd never done before in her life and try to steer 24 people, herself included, out of a disaster in real time. What she said next she would think about for years afterward, not because it was particularly clever, but because it worked, and she'd had no reason to believe it would. "You've got about 4 minutes." Silence. The young man with the gun turned back to her. "What?" "The patrol car that circles this block." She kept her voice the same, level, practical, like she was explaining how the coffee machine worked to a new employee. "Officer Briggs. He comes by at 2:18 on Tuesday nights. I know because he comes in after for coffee and pie, and he's been doing it for 2 years. He'll see your car outside. He'll come in." She watched his face. The fear that had already been there deepened immediately. She could almost see the math happening behind his eyes. 4 minutes, 3 men. How far is the car? What street did we park on? "She's lying," said the man by the door. His voice was flat and controlled. He didn't look away from the window. "Maybe," Talia said. She turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the man by the door, without fully looking away from the gun. "Or maybe I've worked this shift every Tuesday for 2 years and I know exactly what happens at 2:18. A beat. Another beat. "Marcus." The name came from the third man, the follower near the jukebox. He was looking at the one with the shotgun. His voice was uneasy. "Marcus, come on. We got enough." The man by the door, the planner, finally turned from the window. He looked at Talia with an expression that was harder to read than the others. It wasn't fear. It wasn't rage. It was something almost like evaluation, which should have frightened her and somehow didn't. "Let's go," he said. The one called Marcus, the young man with the gun, held the barrel level at Talia for another 3 seconds. His jaw was working like he was chewing on something. Like leaving felt like losing, and he wasn't sure how to do that without the moment meaning something. "You got lucky," he said. "I know," she said. She watched him put the gun down. She watched them leave. She stood behind the counter and listened to the door swing shut and the bell ring above it, and she kept her hands flat on the counter surface because they had started to shake about 30 seconds ago, and she hadn't wanted anyone to see that. Jean's voice came from the corner, quiet and a little rough. "Young lady, you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Everybody call 911, please." She picked up the phone from the cradle beneath the counter and began dialing, and she was aware, distantly, that her heart was only now beginning to catch up with what the last 6 minutes had actually been. The college kids were already on their phones. The woman who'd been staring at bad news on her screen was now on her feet, helping Jean back to his seat. The ordinary machinery of a crisis aftermath was grinding into motion. Sirens in the distance, voices overlapping, someone asking where the bathroom was in the thin, specific way that meant they needed a minute alone. Talia gave her statement to the police at 2:41 a.m. She answered the same 8 questions 3 times for 2 different officers and a plainclothes detective who introduced himself as Rourke and kept looking at her with a particular kind of attention she didn't entirely like. "You stayed calm through all of it?" he asked. "I stayed functional," she said. There was a difference, but she wasn't sure how to explain it. She clocked out at 6:15. Danny arrived smelling like cigarettes and raised his eyebrows at the police tape across 2 of the booths. She told him what happened in 4 sentences and left before he could ask more questions. She walked home. The city was doing what it always did at that hour, shifting from the thin, sleepless energy of 4 a.m. into the gray mechanical warmth of early morning. Trucks making deliveries. A man walking a dog that had stopped to smell something interesting on the corner of Ashland. A woman in scrubs moving at the particular pace of someone coming off a long shift and counting down the steps to their own front door. Talia was 3 blocks from her apartment when she noticed the car. Black sedan, parked at the curb. Not unusual. But it had been there when she left the diner, and it had moved, not followed her exactly, but it was here now and it hadn't been here before. She kept walking, didn't look directly at it, filed the plate number in the back of her mind the way she filed everything, without deciding yet what it meant. She got home. She fed Sargent, who was unimpressed with the hour, and expressed this by knocking her water glass off the nightstand. She lay down on her bed without changing out of her uniform, and stared at the ceiling and tried to decide if what she'd done tonight had been brave or stupid or some third thing that didn't have a clean name yet. She fell asleep before she'd reached a conclusion. She woke up at 1 p.m. to find something had been slipped under her apartment door. A business card. Plain white, expensive stock, the kind of weight that meant someone had paid real money for it. No logo. No phone number. No address. Just a name on the front, Lucian Vale. And 2 words on the back, written in ink so clean it might have been printed, "You're wasted." She turned the card over twice. Then again, she set it on the kitchen counter next to her coffee and stood there for a long moment, looking at it the way she looked at everything she couldn't immediately explain, with attention rather than alarm. Sargent jumped onto the counter and sniffed the card. "Yeah," Talia said. "I know." She didn't throw it away. That was probably the first mistake she made. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. She'd spent a long time trying to figure out which. The business card sat on Talia's kitchen counter for 18 hours before she touched it again. She worked the lunch shift the next day. Danny had called 3 people trying to get coverage after the robbery and ended up begging Talia to come in, and she'd said yes because she needed the money and because staying in the apartment staring at a piece of cardstock wasn't going to help anything. The lunch crowd was different from the night crowd. Louder, faster, less interested in being seen. She moved through it on autopilot, refilling coffee, calling orders back to Marco, making change with her left hand while her right hand wiped down the counter. 3 different customers asked her about the robbery. Word had gotten around. Someone had posted about it on a neighborhood app, apparently, and now Milo's Diner had a small, uncomfortable reputation for the 24 hours following the incident. She answered the questions the same way she'd answered the detective's questions, briefly, accurately, without drama. And each time she finished, the customer looked vaguely disappointed, like they'd expected something with more blood in it. At 4 p.m., she handed off to the evening girl, collected her tips, $62 and a Canadian quarter someone had slipped in thinking she wouldn't notice, and walked home. The card was still there. Lucian Vale. You're wasted. She picked it up this time and held it properly. The stock was heavy, the kind that cost maybe 40 cents a card to print, which meant whoever this man was, he spent money on small things deliberately. The ink on the back was a very dark navy, not quite black, and the handwriting was angular, left-leaning letters, controlled pressure on the downstrokes, like a person who'd trained themselves out of a natural slant. She set it back down. She made herself dinner, which was eggs and whatever was left of the block of cheddar, and she sat at the small table by the window and watched the street below and ate and thought. Lucian Vale. She'd run the name through 2 search engines and found exactly nothing useful. A LinkedIn profile for a financial consultant in Denver who was clearly not the same person, and a brief mention in a 5-year-old Chicago Tribune article about a charity auction that listed him among the donors. The donation amount wasn't specified. His photograph wasn't included. He existed, apparently, in the precise margin of public life where a person was visible enough to be legitimate and invisible enough not to be questioned. That told her something. She was still thinking about what exactly when someone knocked on her door. She didn't move right away. She lived on the 3rd floor of a building where the front door lock had been broken since February, so knocking at her apartment door didn't necessarily mean someone had been buzzed in. It could mean a neighbor, or the super finally coming about the radiator, or the kid from 3B who kept forgetting which unit was his. She crossed to the door and looked through the peephole. A man she'd never seen before. Tall, she could tell even through the fisheye distortion of the peephole, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jacket that fit the way jackets fit when they were made for a specific body rather than adjusted to approximate one. His face was still. Not the stillness of someone bored or waiting. The stillness of someone who had learned how to make their face mean nothing. He wasn't looking at the peephole. He was looking at a point slightly to the left of the door, which meant he was either unconcerned about being watched or he didn't particularly care. Talia put her hand on the deadbolt. "Who are you?" "Someone who was at your diner last night." His voice was low and even, with the particular cadence of a person who almost never raised it. "I left something for you this morning." She didn't open the door. "How do you know where I live?" A pause. Not a hesitant one, a considered one. "You're in the phone book. You list this address." "Nobody's in the phone book." "You are. I found it in 40 seconds. She stood with her hand on the deadbolt for another moment, running a fast, cold calculation. The deadbolt was locked. The chain was on. He was one man in a hallway. She had a phone in her pocket and a clear line of sight to the window that looked onto a reasonably busy street. If she opened the door to the chain and he tried anything, she could close it again and be on the phone with 911 in the time it took him to react. She flipped the deadbolt, left the chain, and opened the door 3 inches. Up close, without the distortion, he was somewhere in his early 40s. The gray at his temples was heavier than she'd thought. His eyes were a very dark brown, and he looked at her the way the plainclothes detective had looked at her, with specific, focused attention. Except where the detective's attention had felt like suspicion, this man's felt like something closer to assessment. "Lucian Vale," she said. "Yes." "You were there last night." "I was in the booth near the back, the one by the emergency exit." She thought about that. She'd registered that booth as occupied when she'd done a room check at 2 a.m. An adult male, coffee only, quiet, not looking for conversation. She'd clocked him as someone who wanted to be left alone and had left him alone. She hadn't looked closely enough to remember his face. "You watched the whole thing," she said. "Yes." "And you didn't do anything." Something moved through his expression, not guilt exactly, but its functional cousin. "No." "Okay." She looked at him for another moment. "What do you want?" "To talk to you, 10 minutes. Not here. There's a place on Wicker Park. Quiet, booth in the back. I'll buy you coffee." "I just worked a 9-hour shift." "I know. I can see that." He glanced at her briefly, the uniform, the tiredness around her eyes, and then looked back at her face. "I'm not going to waste your time. If what I want to offer you isn't worth 10 minutes of it, you walk and I don't contact you again." She should have said no. Every reasonable instinct said no. A stranger who knew where she lived, who'd watched a robbery without intervening, who communicated through expensive business cards left under doors. No reasonable person followed that stranger to a quiet booth in Wicker Park for coffee. But there was something in the way he stood. Not threatening, the opposite actually. I was giving her space, deliberately, the way you gave space to a decision you wanted to be made freely. And there was something in the specificity of what he'd said. If what I want to offer you isn't worth 10 minutes of it, not I have something to tell you, not you're in danger or I can help you. An offer. A conditional one. She made a decision she wasn't entirely sure about. Give me 5 minutes to change, she said. He nodded. He didn't say thank you. She appreciated that. Gratitude would have felt like manipulation. She closed the door, took off her uniform, put on jeans and a dark green pullover, and spent 30 seconds staring at herself in the bathroom mirror. Sergeant appeared in the doorway and stared at her with his one good eye. I know, she said again. Second time in 2 days she'd said that to a cat. She put her phone in her front pocket, her keys in her right hand, grip already sorted, not quite a weapon but closer to one than a loose handful, and opened the door. He was still standing in the hallway, exactly where she'd left him. They walked to the coffee place without talking. The booth in the back was, in fact, quiet, and it was already reserved. She could tell by the way the young woman behind the counter looked at Lucian and gave a small nod before they'd said anything. He came here. He had arrangements. That was either reassuring because it meant he planned ahead, or alarming for exactly the same reason. He waited until they had coffee before he spoke. What you did last night, he said, took something that most people don't have. I told a scared kid that a cop was coming, she said. It wasn't complicated. It was entirely complicated. He turned his cup slightly on the saucer. You read 3 people under extreme pressure, identified the hierarchy between them, found the pressure point on the one holding the weapon, and resolved a situation that had at least 2 viable trajectories towards serious violence. In under 6 minutes. Without training. Without backup. Without any apparent plan except the one you built in real time. Talia looked at him. You were timing me. I had a watch. You let it go on. A pause. Yes. Why? He met her eyes directly. Because I needed to see if it was instinct or luck. The quiet between them had a different quality after that. She could feel herself reassessing, not panicking, but recalibrating. This man hadn't watched the robbery because he was afraid to intervene. He'd watched it because he'd wanted to see what she would do, which meant he'd known enough about her to be curious before he walked in that door. How long have you known about me? She said. 2 weeks. A colleague mentioned you. Someone you helped. A situation at the diner about a month ago, a domestic dispute between a man and his wife. The husband was in a bad place. You talked to him for 40 minutes while someone else called for help. He didn't hurt anyone. She remembered it. She hadn't thought of it as remarkable. The man had been crying into his coffee and shaking, and she'd sat across from him in the empty diner and asked him what was going on, and he'd told her, and she'd listened, and she'd kept him there while Danny had quietly called his sister. Simple. Human. Your colleague saw that, she said. My colleague was the husband's brother. He was in the parking lot trying to decide whether to come inside or call someone. You handled it before he had to make that choice. She turned her coffee cup, thought about the 2 weeks. Thought about the car that had been parked on Ashland that morning, the black sedan. You had someone watching me. No denial. I needed to know what I was looking at before I approached you. You had someone watching me for 2 weeks, and you think I should sit here and have coffee with you. I think, he said carefully, that if you were going to leave, you'd have left before we ordered. She didn't respond to that because it was accurate, and she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of acknowledging it. What's the offer? She said. Lucian Vale leaned back slightly. For the first time since she'd opened her door, he seemed to take a breath that wasn't controlled, like this part mattered to him differently than the rest of it. I need someone who can read people the way you read people, he said. I deal with situations that require a specific kind of intelligence, not legal intelligence, not physical intelligence. The ability to walk into a room with dangerous people and understand what's actually happening beneath what's being said. Identify the real problem, find the path through it that doesn't end with anyone dead. You're in organized crime, she said. The words came out flat, not accusing, just naming what was sitting on the table between them. He didn't flinch. I manage significant interests in this city, some of which operate outside conventional legal frameworks. That's a very careful way of saying yes. Yes, he said. I'm in organized crime. She sat with that for a moment. The coffee shop had 3 other customers, a young couple arguing quietly about something, and an older man doing a crossword. The girl behind the counter was wiping down the espresso machine. Everything very ordinary. Everything very far from what she was currently in the middle of. "No," she said. Lucian nodded. He looked like he'd expected it. "I understand," he said. "I don't want anything to do with your father owes money." The sentence landed with the precision of something that had been timed carefully. She went still. "Calvin Monroe?" Lucian's voice was level. No cruelty in it, but no softness either. 63 years old, lives on the northwest side. Used to do purchasing work for a mid-sized shipping company before he retired early. Took out a loan 3 years ago from people who aren't patient about repayment schedules. Talia's fingers had gone cold around the coffee cup. "How much?" $47,000, at an interest rate that has made it considerably more than that. "How much more?" "At last count, 72,000. She breathed in slowly through her nose. She knew about the loan. Her father had told her about part of it, a year ago, when he'd needed help with a smaller debt, and she'd given him $400 she couldn't afford and hadn't asked too many questions because the questions felt like accusations. And she loved her father, and he was not a bad man, but he had a specific weakness for believing that the next thing would be the thing that fixed everything. She hadn't known it had gotten to 72,000. "The men he owes," she said. "Who are they?" "Contractors I have occasional dealings with. They're not patient men. They have a specific process for handling debts that exceed a certain threshold, and your father is currently 4 months past that threshold." She looked at Lucian Vale directly. "Are you threatening my father to get me to work for you?" He didn't look away. "I'm telling you a fact about your father's situation because you deserve to know it. Whether or not it influences your decision is your business." "That's still a threat." "It's information," he said. "A threat would be if I'd told you what happens to him if you say no. I haven't said that." "You were about to." A very small pause. "No. I was going to tell you that if you agree to a 60-day trial period, 3 specific meetings, nothing more, I will erase the debt completely. Your father will owe nothing to anyone." Talia looked at him for a long time. Sargent had been right. She'd known before she put her shoes on. She just hadn't wanted to name it yet. 3 meetings, she said. 3. What kind of meetings? The kind where someone needs to read the room and tell me what's actually happening. No weapons, no violence. You walk in, you observe, you tell me what you see. That's the entire job. And if I see something that leads to violence, that's why I need someone who prevents it. She looked down at the table, thought about her father, Calvin Monroe, who could make anyone laugh at a dinner table, and who had spent his whole life believing the world was about to turn in his direction if he just held on a little longer, and who had passed that specific hopefulness on to Talia in a way that she'd spent years quietly dismantling in herself, because she'd learned early that hope without observation was just a pretty way to be blindsided. I need to think, she said. Of course. Don't contact me tomorrow. Understood. She stood up. He made no move to stop her, asked nothing further, added nothing. She walked to the door of the coffee shop and pushed it open into the cool night air and started walking in the direction of home. And she didn't look back. And she hated the fact that not looking back required any effort at all. She called her father that night, not to ask about the money, just to hear his voice. He was cheerful on the phone the way he always was, telling her about a documentary he'd watched and a conversation he'd had with his neighbor about tomatoes. And she listened to all of it and said the right things. And when she hung up, she sat in the dark for a while. $72,000. She could not earn $72,000 in any time frame that would help him. She'd done the math before she'd even hung up the phone because she always did the math whether she wanted to or not. She made her decision somewhere around midnight, sitting on the floor of her apartment with her back against the couch, and Sargent asleep across her feet. She didn't feel good about it. She didn't feel righteous or brave or compelled by something larger than herself. She felt tired and pragmatic and quietly furious at the specific series of circumstances that had gotten her here. She picked up the business card. She turned it over. You're wasted. She set her alarm for 7 and went to sleep. She called the number on the card the next morning. There was no number on the card, but there had been a number in the bottom margin, printed so small she'd almost missed it, and she'd had to hold it under the kitchen light to read it. It rang once. Lucian picked up. 3 meetings, she said. No weapons on me, no physical danger, and you tell me everything I need to know before I walk into any room. The debt is erased when I complete the 3rd meeting, not after. I want that confirmed in writing. A pause. In writing is complicated in my line of work. Then we have a problem. Another pause, longer this time. I'll have documentation prepared. Not signed contracts, but something specific enough that you'd know if I violated it. And if you violate it, then you can walk away from whatever's left of the arrangement and I'll honor the debt erasure regardless. Why would you do that? Because, he said, and his voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard before. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. The kind of person I need cannot be a person I've coerced. You working for me under duress is useless. You working for me because we have an agreement you believe in is worth considerably more than your father's debt. She hated that this made sense. When's the first meeting? She said. 3 days from now, Thursday evening. Where? I'll send a car. I'll take the L. A very brief pause. Fine. She hung up and stood in her kitchen in the early morning light and thought, this is where it changes. Not the robbery, not the business card. This phone call, this morning, this decision made from a place that was 3 parts practicality and 1 part something she wasn't ready to name. She went to work. She told no one. The first meeting was in a building she didn't know in a part of the city she rarely visited, the kind of neighborhood that had been industrial once and was now occupied by the specific combination of old money and new renovation that meant very expensive things were happening behind unmarked doors. Lucian met her outside. I was with a man she hadn't seen before, mid-50s, compact, going bald at the crown but not trying to hide it, wearing a suit that was expensive enough to be noticeable and chosen specifically to be noticed. This is Garrett Moss, Lucian said. He manages our financial operations. Garrett Moss looked at her the way people looked at things they thought were unnecessary. This is the waitress? This is Talia Monroe, Lucian said. The correction was quiet but specific. Garrett Moss smiled in a way that meant nothing. Right. Inside, up 2 flights of stairs, in a room with no windows and a conference table that had seen better decades, sat a man named Dennis Ray. Ray was 40-something with the kind of tan that came from vacations rather than work, and he was sitting with his hands folded on the table in the manner of someone who had rehearsed looking relaxed. The accusation, Lucian had explained in the car, she'd agreed to let him explain on the way, was that Ray had been diverting funds from 3 different accounts over 14 months. Small amounts, structured carefully, spread across legitimate transactions, maybe 200,000 total. Ray was denying it. Talia sat against the wall. Lucian had offered her a seat at the table. She'd refused, and she watched. Ray spoke well. His denials were detailed, which was usually either a sign of truth or of very good preparation. He made eye contact with Lucian directly when he spoke, which was what people did when they'd been told that eye contact conveyed honesty. He kept his hands on the table, visible, the way hostage negotiators told people to do, and the way people who'd read about hostage negotiation did when they wanted to look unthreatening. But his right heel was bouncing. Not dramatically. She'd have missed it if she hadn't been watching his lower body. A tiny rhythmic movement just below the table line, the physical exhaust valve for energy that had nowhere else to go. And he kept using a specific phrase, to be completely honest with you, 3 times in the first 10 minutes. People said that phrase when they were about to say something true, but surrounding context was less so. And when Garrett Moss's phone buzzed on the table, just a notification, silenced quickly. Ray's eyes went to it for less than half a second before returning to Lucian's face. Less than half a second, but his breathing changed slightly afterward, like he'd just checked something. Talia waited. The conversation went in circles for 20 minutes. Lucian was patient. Garrett Moss was not. He interrupted twice, and both times Ray's jaw tightened in a way that wasn't anger, but was something closer to controlled fear. After 22 minutes, Talia stood up from her chair against the wall. Everyone looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" she said to Ray. Ray looked at Lucian first, a tell, and then back at her. "Sure. Who else knew about the shortfall in the Meridian account before last month?" A silence. Ray's heel stopped moving. "What?" "The Meridian account. There was a shortfall reported internally about 3 months ago, and it got resolved quietly before anyone senior saw it. I'm just wondering who else in your department knew about it." Everything in the room changed. Ray's face did something complicated. The sequence was too fast to name each piece of it, but the beginning was surprise and the end was the particular blankness that descends when someone realizes they've just been located. "I don't know what shortfall you're talking about," he said. "Okay." She sat back down. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Garrett Moss, whose expression had shifted from impatient to very alert. Ray started talking again, faster now, denser, filling the silence the way people filled silences when they were afraid of what the silence contained. And as he talked, she watched him talk himself into a corner that had nothing to do with what she'd actually asked him. There was no shortfall in the Meridian account. She'd made it up entirely. She had no idea what the Meridian account was. But he did. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. In the hallway, on the way out, Garrett Moss stopped walking and turned to look at her. The expression on his face was no longer dismissive. "Where did you hear about Meridian?" he said. "I didn't," she said. He stared at her. "He did something to that account," she said. "I don't know the details, but whatever he did, he was afraid someone else in his department was going to talk about it first. And that fear is why he took the money the way he did. Small amounts, structured, spread out. He wasn't stealing to get rich. He was stealing to cover something. That's different." Garrett Moss looked at her for another 3 seconds, then looked at Lucian, then walked away without saying anything more. Lucian waited until Moss was out of earshot. Then he said, "There is a Meridian account." She looked at him. "It had an actual shortfall 3 months ago. Ray was one of 2 people who knew about it." She felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Who's the other person?" "Garrett Moss." The hallway was quiet. The building's heating system ticked and hummed. Talia stood very still while the situation rearranged itself in her mind. Not slowly, but all at once. Once, the pieces falling into new positions like someone had picked up the board and tilted it. Ray wasn't the only one stealing, and she'd just, in front of Garrett Moss himself, demonstrated that she could find things that weren't supposed to be found. "Does Moss know what I just figured out?" she said. Lucian's expression told her the answer before he spoke it. "He will," he said. She looked toward the stairwell where Moss had disappeared, and she thought, "I walked into this room as a stranger, and I'm walking out of it as something else entirely." She just didn't know yet what that something was, or what it was going to cost her to find out. She didn't sleep that night. Not because she was afraid, or not only because of that. It was more that her brain had locked onto the problem the way it locked onto everything that didn't add up, and it wouldn't release until she'd turned it over enough times to understand the shape of it. Garrett Moss knew she'd spotted something in that room. He didn't know exactly what she'd spotted, but he knew the direction it pointed, and that was enough. A man who had been stealing alongside Dennis Ray, covering the same shortfall, sharing the same secret, would not sit quietly while a waitress from a North Side diner walked around the edges of it. She lay on her back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to Sargent breathe. Ray was the distraction. That was what she kept coming back to. Lucian had brought her in to look at Ray, and Ray had been stealing. That part was true. But Ray had been stealing to cover something, and the something was connected to Garrett Moss, and Garrett Moss had been in that room watching her find the thread. She thought about the way Moss had walked away down that hallway. Not quickly, deliberately. The walk of a man who had made a decision and was already moving toward its execution. At 3 a.m., she got up and wrote everything down in the small notebook she kept by the stove. Names, sequences, the specific moment Ray's heel had stopped moving, the look on Moss's face when she'd said the word Meridian. She wrote it in the cramped, abbreviated shorthand she'd developed over years of trying to keep track of things she wasn't supposed to be keeping track of. Then she went back to bed and finally slept. And she dreamed about the diner, about the shotgun, about the way the young man's hands had shaken. Lucian called her at 7:15. "I need you to come in," he said. "Come in where?" "My office. The building on Fulton. I'll text you the address." "It's 7 in the morning." "I know. Come now." She recognized something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not urgency. Lucian Vale did not do urgency. She was already learning. Something more compressed than that. The voice of a person for whom a variable had shifted overnight, and the new math wasn't good. She dressed, fed Sargent, and took the L. The building on Fulton was a converted warehouse with a ground-floor architecture firm as its public face, and apparently a different kind of operation above it. Lucian met her at the side entrance, not the front, and walked her up a service staircase that smelled like concrete and old pipe insulation. His office was on the third floor. She'd expected something that announced itself because everything about Lucian Vale was deliberate, but the room was plain. A desk, two chairs, a window looking onto the alley. A whiteboard on one wall covered in columns of numbers. No decoration, no ego on the walls. He was already on his feet when she came in, which meant he'd been pacing, which was the first genuinely uncontrolled thing she'd seen from him. Seated in one of the two chairs was a man she recognized, Detective Evan Rourke. She stopped walking. Rourke looked up at her. He was in plain clothes, same as the night of the robbery. Dark jacket, dark slacks, the particular kind of unremarkable that was its own camouflage. He looked tired. He also looked like he'd been in this room for a while. "Miss Monroe," he said. "Detective." She looked at Lucian. "Explain." "Rourke has photographs," Lucian said. He moved to the desk and picked up a manila envelope and held it toward her. She crossed the room and took it. Inside were 5 photographs. 8 by 10, printed crisp, the kind of image quality that came from a long lens and a skilled operator. They showed the exterior of the building from last night, the entrance, the staircase window, and her. Her face, clearly identifiable, entering and exiting the building. One photograph caught her mid-stride on the sidewalk next to Lucian, both of them visible, her face turned slightly toward him at an angle that made the conversation between them obvious. "When were these taken?" she said. "Last night," Rourke said, "between 7 and 9 p.m. "By who?" Rourke leaned back in the chair. He had the manner of a man deciding how much to put on the table. "Doesn't matter who. What matters is that you're in them, they've been logged, and you're now documentably connected to Lucian Vale in a context that is not a coffee shop." She put the photographs back in the envelope, set it on the desk. "You're investigating him." "I've been investigating him for 14 months, Rourke said, "and I've been investigating the Voss organization for longer than that. You walked into the middle of something that's considerably larger than a debt collection arrangement." She looked at Lucian. His expression was controlled in the way it always was, but there was something underneath it now, a particular tension around the jaw that meant he was making calculations he didn't like the outcome of. "You knew he was investigating you," she said to Lucian. "I knew there was surveillance," Lucian said. "I didn't know the scope." "You didn't tell me." "I told you there were risks." "You said the meetings were low exposure." Her voice stayed level. She made it stay level. "You said I'd walk in, observe, walk out, and nothing would follow me home." That was accurate as of 48 hours ago. It stopped being accurate when Garrett Moss walked out of that hallway and picked up a phone. A pause. Rourke was watching the exchange between them with the careful attention of a man who was learning something he'd wanted to know for a while. "What does Moss have to do with the photographs?" Talia said, turning to Rourke. Rourke's expression shifted, just slightly, a small tightening around the eyes that meant she'd said something he hadn't expected. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. "The meeting last night. He was there." Rourke looked at Lucian. Something passed between them that she wasn't supposed to see. Not a look of conspiracy, but the particular exchange between two people who had been circling the same information from different directions and had just discovered their circles overlapped. "Garrett Moss," Rourke said slowly, "is not one of Lucian's people." She waited. "Moss runs financial operations for the Voss organization," Rourke said. "Darius Voss. He was placed in Lucian's network 14 months ago as an informant. He's been feeding information to Voss about Lucian's operations the entire time." The room was very quiet. Talia stood and let the sentence land and rearrange everything she'd understood about the previous 12 hours. She did it in silence because that was the only way to do it properly, and because any sound she made right now would come out wrong. Moss wasn't Lucian's man. Moss was Voss's man. A plant. 14 months inside Lucian's financial operations, feeding information across, and nobody had found him because he was good at what he did. Good enough that the only thread she'd found was a panicked look and a heel that stopped moving. "Does Lucian know who Moss works for?" she said. She was asking Rourke, but she kept her eyes on Lucian. "He does now," Lucian said. "When did you find out?" "This morning. 2 hours ago." A pause. "After you left last night, Moss made 3 phone calls. One of my people intercepted the second one." "Who did he call?" "A man named Silas Crane. Crane is Darius Voss's lieutenant. She turned the name over. What did he tell Crane? Lucian's jaw moved slightly. That someone new had been brought in, someone with a specific ability to locate embedded information, that she needed to be dealt with. The word she landed in the room with a specific weight. Talia sat down in the empty chair. Not because her legs were giving out, she was fine, she was holding it together, but because standing felt suddenly like theater, and she had no interest in theater right now. She needed to think. She looked at Rourke. Why are you here? You're police. If I'm in those photographs, you should be arresting Lucian and questioning me separately. Rourke's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. I've been building a case against Darius Voss for 3 years. He's moved product, laundered money, ordered 2 murders that I can partially prove and a third that I can't, and he's insulated himself from every piece of evidence I've collected by putting people like Moss inside operations like this one. He gestured minimally at Lucian. Lucian Vale and I have an arrangement. What kind of arrangement? The kind where I don't pursue certain activities in exchange for information that helps me pursue much larger ones. You're protecting him. I'm prioritizing, Rourke said. The distinction clearly mattered to him. Voss runs violence. Voss runs serious organized harm at a scale that... He stopped, recalibrated. I need Voss. And right now the fastest path to Voss runs through a meeting that's been arranged for 3 days from now. She looked between them. What meeting? Lucian spoke. Voss requested a face-to-face. Territorial discussion. There's a conflict over distribution rights on the southwest side that's been escalating for months. He wants to negotiate directly. And you're going, she said to Lucian. I have to go. Refusing isn't an option. Because refusing looks like weakness. Because refusing looks like guilt, he said. Voss already suspects Moss's cover is compromised. If I decline the meeting, it confirms it, and Moss disappears, and I lose whatever information I might have gotten from this. Talia pressed the tips of her fingers together and stared at the middle distance. The whiteboard on the wall behind Lucian had numbers on it that meant nothing to her, but the columns had a shape, the shape of money being tracked across multiple sources, and she found herself reading the structure of it without meaning to. You want me at the meeting, she said. Neither man answered immediately. This wasn't part of the 3 meetings, she said. This is different. The second meeting was going to be preliminary, Lucian said. Standard. This is not what you described. No, he said. It isn't. She looked at him. You withheld information from me. Before the first meeting. You knew Moss was in that room and you didn't tell me he was connected to Voss. I didn't know he was connected to Voss. You knew there was a Meridian account and you didn't tell me that either. She kept her voice even. It was effort. I went in there and baited a man into revealing something, and I didn't know the real thing I was revealing it to was sitting on the other side of the table. Lucian said nothing. He didn't look away from her, which she gave him credit for. A lesser man would have looked at the desk. I could have walked out of that building, she said, and Moss could have made 1 phone call, and I'd have had no idea that I needed to be careful walking home. I know, Lucian said. That is not acceptable. I know that too. Rourke was watching them both the way he'd watched the exchange at the beginning, learning, cataloging. She suspected he did this with everything. She suspected that was what made him functional at a job that required sitting with very bad people in small rooms for a very long time. What is it you actually want from me? She said to Rourke directly. Not him. You. Rourke took a breath. Voss is going to bring Crane to this meeting. Silas Crane is... He paused. He's smart. Smarter than Voss in most practical ways. He's also ambitious, and I have evidence suggesting he's been building a private position for about 8 months. Money moved into accounts Voss doesn't know about. Relationships established with Voss's rivals. Very careful preparation for a transition of power that hasn't happened yet. Crane wants to take over from Voss, she said. I think so. But I can't prove the internal dynamics without someone in that room who can read what's happening between them in real time. Someone who can tell me whether what I think is happening is actually happening. And if it is, then I have grounds for a different approach to the prosecution, one that doesn't require me to go through Lucian's organization at all. She sat with this. The situation had a new shape now. She could see it the way she could see a room the moment she walked in, the exits, the power structure, who was afraid and who was performing. Rourke needed intelligence from inside the Voss meeting that he couldn't get any other way. Lucian needed someone in that room who could read what Voss and Crane were actually doing beneath what they were saying. And she was currently the person in both photographs and neither camp, which made her useful and also very specifically vulnerable. "I want to talk to you alone," she said to Lucian. She looked at Rourke. "Give us 5 minutes." Rourke stood without argument and left the room, pulling the door behind him. She waited until his footsteps receded in the hallway. "Tell me everything you didn't tell me," she said. "Right now, all of it, because I am sitting in a room with a police detective who has photographs of my face, and there is a man named Crane who was told last night that I need to be dealt with, and I am going to need to understand exactly what I'm in the middle of before I make any decisions about what happens next." Lucian was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down behind his desk, the first time he'd sat since she'd arrived, and he looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time, not entirely managed. "Voss and I have been in a territorial conflict for 8 months," he said. "Southwest distribution, as I told Rourke. That part is accurate. What I didn't tell Rourke is that the conflict started because Voss made a move on a specific account that I had an agreement to leave untouched. A private arrangement. One that involved a third party who doesn't want to be involved in this conversation." "Who is the third party?" "Someone who has information about Voss that Voss would burn the entire city down to suppress." She looked at him. "And you know what that information is?" "Yes." "Does Voss know you know?" "He suspects. It's part of why he pushed into the disputed territory, not because he needed it, but because he needed a reason to be aggressive toward me that didn't involve the real reason." She pressed her fingers together again. "What's the information?" Lucian looked at her for a long moment. 3 years ago, a man named Petrov, a Ukrainian operator who was attempting to expand into Chicago, was killed. The official story was that Petrov was taken out by one of his own people over a money dispute. The real story is that Voss ordered it and framed the associate. The associate spent 14 months in county before the case fell apart. "That's murder," she said. "It's one of 3, Lucian said. The other 2 I only have partial records on. This one I have complete documentation. And Rourke doesn't have this. Rourke has the framed associate's case. He doesn't have what connects it to Voss." She thought about Rourke in the hallway, the tiredness behind his eyes, the 3 years he'd said he'd been building the case. She thought about what it meant that the final piece of the case Rourke had been building for 3 years was currently sitting in a folder somewhere in Lucian Vale's possession. "Why haven't you given it to him?" she said. "Because the moment I give that to Rourke, Voss knows it came from me. And before any arrest can happen, before any legal process can protect me, Voss will move. He'll move against you. Against me and anyone associated with me." He looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you this now because you asked, and because you were right. I put you in that room without the full picture, and Moss saw you find the thread, and now you're in a position you didn't consent to be in. You deserve to understand the actual stakes." Talia was quiet for what felt like a long time. Outside the window, the alley was filling with the gray-white light of a cloudy morning. She could hear a truck somewhere below, the distant percussion of a city starting its day without any knowledge of the room she was sitting in. "The meeting with Voss," she said. "Where is it?" "Private location, a building in Bridgeport. Voss chooses the location and we accept, because that's the protocol. The party requesting the meeting chooses, and the other party accepts as a gesture of good faith. Voss's territory. Yes. And Crane will be there. Always. Crane doesn't let Voss out of his sight." She thought about what Rourke had said about Crane. 8 months of preparation. Accounts Voss didn't know about. A transition being built in the margins. "Crane isn't coming to translate for Voss," she said slowly. "He's coming to watch Voss perform." Lucian frowned slightly. "Explain." "If Crane is planning a takeover, then every meeting Voss has right now is information for Crane, not for Voss. He's watching how Voss handles pressure. He's looking for the moment when Voss says something or does something that Crane can use. He's not there to support his boss. He's there to study him." Lucian was very still. "Which means," she continued, "that the meeting isn't just a territorial negotiation. It's a performance with 2 different audiences. Voss thinks he's negotiating with you. Crane is watching to see if Voss is strong enough to survive." A silence. "And I'm supposed to walk in there," she said, "and read both of them simultaneously." "Yes," Lucian said. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked at the alley below. A delivery driver unloading boxes, a pigeon on a dumpster lid, and she stood there long enough to make the decision cleanly, without rushing it. She turned around. "New terms," she said. "Before we let Rourke back in." Lucian waited. "I walk into that meeting knowing everything. Not a summarized version, not what you think I need to know. Everything. The Petrov documentation, the full picture of what Crane has been building, whatever private arrangement you have with the third party, all of it. Some of that information could put you in a more dangerous position. I am already in a dangerous position," she said. "What I am not is blind. And I will not walk into a room with Darius Voss and Silas Crane being blind." She paused. "If you withhold anything again, anything, I go directly to Rourke and I tell him everything I know and I let him do what he does with it. Are we clear?" Lucian looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not the way things shifted in movies, just a small recalibration, the way a compass adjusted. "Clear," he said, "and the debt. My father's debt. I want written confirmation of the erasure before I walk into that building, not after." "That wasn't the original arrangement." "The original arrangement," she said, "was made before someone called Silas Crane was told I needed to be dealt with. The terms changed when your information changed. So, do mine." Another silence. "Yes," he said, "before you walk in." She went to the door and opened it. Rourke was in the hallway, leaning against the opposite wall with his arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular. He looked up when the door opened. "Okay," she said. "Tell me everything you have on Crane." Rourke pushed off the wall. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded sheet of paper, photographs, she realized when he handed it to her, printed from digital files, grainy but clear enough. A man, mid-40s, with a face that was not memorable in any individual feature, but composed itself into something that stayed with you. The eyes especially, pale, focused, the eyes of someone who was always measuring distance. "Silas Crane," Rourke said, "former military intelligence. 12 years in and out of private security contracts before he ended up with Voss 7 years ago. He is, without question, the most operationally dangerous person in the Voss organization." She studied the photograph. "He's not going to be rattled the way Ray was," she said. "No," Rourke said, "he won't. And he already knows about me." "After Moss's call last night, yes. He knows someone new has been brought in. He doesn't know your name, your face, or your specific ability. He knows you exist." She looked at the photograph a moment longer. Crane's expression in the image was almost neutral. Almost. There was something in the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his attention, that reminded her of the man who'd stood by the door during the robbery, the one she'd clocked as the planner, the one who hadn't been afraid. Those were the hardest kind. Rourke's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and she watched his face do something it hadn't done in the conversation so far, tighten, specifically, around the eyes. "What?" she said. He showed her the screen. A text from a number she didn't recognize, 8 words long. She was photographed entering and leaving. Crane knows. The room shifted. Not the walls. The walls were fine. The room inside her head shifted, the one where she kept the map of the situation, and all the positions on it moved at once. Crane knew who she was, or enough of who she was to make the photograph meaningful, which meant between last night and this morning, someone had connected her face to her name and her name to the meeting on Thursday. She looked at Lucian. His expression was the flattest she'd seen it. "The photographs Rourke has," she said. "Who else has copies?" Rourke and Lucian looked at each other. The look lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was enough. "Someone inside this arrangement," she said. "Someone who's been feeding copies of surveillance to Crane." She looked at Rourke. "How many people know about your arrangement with Lucian?" Rourke's jaw was tight. 3. Myself and 2 people in my unit. "One of those 3 people," she said, "is working for Crane." The sentence sat in the room. No one argued with it. No one had a better explanation for the text on Rourke's phone, and they all knew it. She stood in the office of a crime boss she'd agreed to work for 3 days ago, and looked at a detective whose own unit had been compromised. And she thought about her father sitting in his house on the northwest side, watching documentaries about tomatoes. And she thought about the photograph of Silas Crane and the pale, focused eyes, and the military intelligence background. She thought about the meeting in 3 days. She thought about what she was walking into and what she was walking in without, and the specific, unambiguous nature of what it meant to be the person Crane was looking for in a building that Voss had chosen, and in a room where she would be the only one whose position was entirely exposed. She was not afraid, exactly, but she understood for the first time the full geometry of what had happened to her life since the night a young man pressed a shotgun against her chest. And she had smiled, and the understanding had the particular quality of a door closing, not violently, not dramatically, just. The 3 days before Thursday moved, the way time moved when the body understood something the mind was still catching up to. Too fast in the empty stretches, then suddenly viscous and slow in the moments that mattered. Talia spent the first day in Lucian's office going through everything he had. Not summaries, not selected portions, everything. She sat at the desk he vacated for her and read through 14 months of financial intercepts, communication logs, territorial maps, and the Petrov documentation that Lucian had been holding like a card he couldn't play yet. She read for 9 hours straight with a legal pad next to her and a pen she'd brought herself because she didn't want to use anything from this room that she hadn't carried in. She filled 22 pages. Lucian stayed in the building. He didn't hover. She gave him credit for that. He kept to the outer room, took calls she couldn't hear, sent a man she didn't know to bring food at one point, which she ate without tasting. When she came out at 9 p.m. with the legal pad under her arm, he was at the window looking at the street below, and he turned and looked at her and waited. Crane has been running parallel operations for 8 months, she said, but not to take over from Voss immediately. He's building a buffer, a network of relationships and accounts that exist independently of Voss's structure so that when the transition happens, Crane doesn't need to inherit anything. He can just leave Voss's organization in place and step around it. Lucian frowned slightly. That's different from a takeover. It's smarter than a takeover. A takeover means conflict. Voss's loyalists push back. There's a period of instability. Law enforcement notices the disruption. What Crane is doing is building a shadow organization alongside Voss's. When he's ready, he won't overthrow Voss. He'll just stop supporting him, and Voss's operation will collapse on its own because Crane has quietly moved all the functional pieces somewhere else. Lucian was quiet for a moment. How long before he's ready? Based on what I read, 60 to 90 days, maybe less. She looked at him. The meeting Thursday isn't just Voss negotiating territory. It's Crane deciding whether Voss is stable enough to be useful for the remaining time he needs, or whether Voss has become a liability that needs to be removed faster. What makes Voss a liability? If Voss does something reckless at Thursday's meeting, if he overplays, makes demands he can't enforce, gets aggressive in ways that bring attention, Crane needs Voss to hold it together for 60 more days. If Voss can't do that, Crane accelerates. She paused. And there's something else. Tell me. The Petrov documentation you have. Crane knows it exists. Not where, but he knows Voss made a specific mistake with Petrov and that someone has evidence of it. I think that's part of what he's been building around. If the documentation surfaces, Voss goes down legally, which means Crane's transition needs to happen before that, or Crane goes down with him by association. Lucian looked at her steadily. You got all of that from the files. The files gave me the pieces, she said. The shape of it was already there. I just needed to know what I was looking at. He was quiet for another moment. Then, what do you need for Thursday? I need to know Voss's patterns, how he opens, whether he lets Crane talk in front of outsiders or keeps him quiet, whether he's the kind of man who performs strength or whether he actually believes he has it. He performs, Lucian said without hesitation. He's been performing for 20 years. He's very good at it, but underneath the performance, he's reactive. Someone challenges his authority in the right way, and he stops thinking. Good, she said. That's useful. In what way useful? If I need him distracted, I'll know how to distract him. Lucian looked at her with an expression she'd started to recognize, the one where he was reassessing what he was dealing with and updating accordingly. It wasn't patronizing. It was the look of a person trying to maintain an accurate picture of a situation that kept changing. She went home. She slept 6 hours. Not enough, but enough. She woke up and ran 3 miles in the cold morning air, not because she was athletic, but because her body needed to do something with the energy that had been building for 2 days, and running was clean and simple and required nothing from her except forward motion. When she got back, she showered and called her father. Calvin Monroe picked up on the second ring, the way he always did, because he kept the phone close and answered quickly, because he was, at his core, accordingly. "Hey, sweetheart." "Hey, Dad." She sat on the edge of the bathtub and looked at the tile. "How are you feeling?" "Good, good. Had breakfast. Watched the news for about 45 seconds before I had to turn it off. You know how I am with the news." "I know." "You okay? You sound... I don't know. You sound like your mother used to sound when she was turning something over." She smiled without meaning to. Her mother had been dead for 8 years, and her father still used her as a reference point for human behavior, which was either devotion or just the specific way he organized the world. "I'm okay," she said. "I'm working something out." "Work stuff?" "Kind of." She paused. "Dad, I need you to know something." "Okay." "Whatever happens in the next few weeks, whatever you hear or don't hear from me, I need you to know that I have a plan. And the plan is about you partly, and it's going to be okay." A silence. Her father was not an unintelligent man. He had a specific blindness for financial risk, but he understood people. That was the thing he'd passed on to her, the attention, the reading. He was quiet now with the particular quality of a person who understood they were being told something in code and was deciding whether to ask for the translation. "Talia," he said, "I'm fine." "You're not telling me something." "I'll tell you everything after, I promise." Another pause. "You sound like your mother," he said again, softer this time. "Good," she said. "I hope so." She hung up and sat on the edge of the bathtub for another minute. Then she stood up and got ready for Thursday. The building in Bridgeport was 3 stories, brick exterior, no signage, wedged between a dry cleaning business and a parking structure that had seen better decades. Rourke had pulled the property records. It was owned through 2 holding companies that eventually resolved to a name that wasn't Darius Voss but was close enough, 3 steps removed, to be effectively his. The neighborhood was the kind that had been mixed residential and light industrial for 40 years, and had never resolved the tension between them into either gentrification or full decline. She arrived 45 minutes early. Not with Lucian. She'd refused that. She took the L to within 6 blocks and walked, wearing a dark jacket and flat shoes and carrying a bag that contained nothing except her phone, her notebook, 2 pens, and the small folded piece of documentation that Lucian had produced the day before. 2 sentences on unmarked paper in a format that was not legally binding but specific enough to matter. "The debt of Calvin Monroe, in full, is hereby discharged. All claims are abandoned. Effective." Thursday, December 4th. He'd handed it to her that morning. She'd read it twice, folded it, and put it in the bag without saying anything. She stood on the corner across from the building and watched it for 22 minutes. 2 men on the door, big, positioned to look casual and not managing it. A car parked on the south side of the building with someone in the driver's seat who was working hard at looking like he wasn't watching the street. A window on the 2nd floor with a light behind it, which meant the meeting room was likely there. The 3rd floor was dark. She noted the exits she could see. The parking structure to the east had a walkway at the 2nd level that connected to the dry cleaner's roof. Probably locked, probably alarmed, but probably not monitored. The alley on the north side of the building terminated at a chain-link fence that backed onto an empty lot. If something went wrong, the south exit, the way she'd come in, would be the first thing closed. The north alley required getting through a fence. The east route required altitude and a locked door. She stored all of it and crossed the street. Lucian was already inside. He'd arrived 15 minutes ahead of her by arrangement, present before she arrived, so that her entrance was an introduction rather than a reunion. The man he'd sent to the door looked at her once, spoke into an earpiece, and stepped aside. Inside, the ground floor was a gutted commercial space. Bare concrete, fluorescent fixtures, folding tables pushed to the walls. 2 more men. She counted without looking like she was counting, moved through the space without hurrying, followed the man with the earpiece up a staircase that had a metal railing and concrete steps, and smelled like dust and old cigarette smoke, and something beneath it that she clocked and filed without examining too closely. The 2nd floor was different. Somebody had made an effort up here. A conference table, actual chairs, lighting that came from a standing lamp in the corner rather than fluorescent overhead. A credenza against one wall with water and glasses. The kind of minimal staging that communicated this was a place where business happened. Lucian was at the far end of the table. He looked at her when she came in. Just a glance, the specific glance they'd agreed on that meant nothing alarming yet, and then looked back at the man sitting across from him. Darius Voss. She'd seen photographs. The photographs hadn't fully prepared her. Voss was 58 and built like a man who had been large when he was young and had compacted rather than diminished with age. Broad through the shoulders, thick through the neck, with hands that rested on the conference table like they were too big for the space around them. His face was heavy-featured, prominent jaw, deep-set eyes, a nose that had been broken at least once and reset imperfectly. He was wearing a gray suit that was expensive but not quite fitted correctly, and he had the particular quality of a large animal that had spent decades ensuring that other large animals maintained a respectful distance. Beside him, positioned one seat back, slightly off the main axis of the table, sat Silas Crane. The photograph had been accurate. In person, Crane was more compact than she'd expected. Not small, just economical. Every movement he made was exactly as large as it needed to be, and no larger. He was watching Lucian with the focused, neutral attention of a man who was taking inventory. His eyes moved to her the moment she entered the room. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to establish that she'd seen him and was not intimidated, short enough not to make it a challenge. And then she moved to the chair against the wall that Lucian had arranged for her, exactly the position she'd taken at the Ray meeting. Voss looked at her with a different quality of attention than Crane, less analytical, more the attention of a man deciding whether an unfamiliar thing is a threat or a prop. "Who's this?" Voss said. His voice was baritone and flat, the voice of a man who'd spent years in rooms where his voice was the last one that needed to have a particular quality. "My analyst," Lucian said. "She observes and advises. She doesn't speak unless I ask her to." Voss looked at her a moment longer. "An analyst." He said the word like he was feeling around the edges of it for something sharp. "Since when do you need an analyst?" "Since the business got complicated enough to benefit from one," Lucian said. Voss made a sound that was approximately a laugh and turned back to Lucian. Crane did not look away from Talia for another 3 seconds. Then he too turned his attention back to the table. She breathed. She let her eyes go soft, not unfocused, but wide rather than directed. The peripheral vision state that let her see the room without looking at any specific part of it. She had discovered this ability a long time ago, in the diner, managing a rush with 4 tables demanding attention simultaneously. The trick was not to track individual things, but to let the room speak as a whole. Voss opened the conversation. He was good. She acknowledged that internally and immediately. He framed the territorial dispute in language that sounded like complaint but was actually ultimatum, and he deployed the specific technique of wrapping his demands inside a history of grievance, so that what he was asking for felt like rightful restoration rather than new acquisition. Lucian responded with equal precision. He acknowledged the history, reframed 2 of the 3 points, and introduced a counterposition that appeared to concede ground while actually consolidating it. She watched Crane. He was watching Voss. Every time Voss made a point, Crane's eyes moved fractionally, not to Lucian's face to see the reaction, but to Voss's face. He was monitoring Voss's performance the way a director monitored an actor in a difficult scene, looking for the moments when the technique slipped and the thing underneath showed through. She watched Crane watch Voss, and she began to map the pattern. When Voss was in control of the argument, Crane's body was still. When Voss began to drift, when he over-explained a point, or when he used language that was more emotional than strategic, Crane's right hand moved. Not dramatically. A small shift, fingertips touching the table surface, like a person steadying themselves. A tell. A tell that wasn't frustration and wasn't disagreement. It was something colder. It was notation. Crane was mentally marking Voss's weaknesses in real time. 20 minutes in, Lucian made a deliberate concession, one they'd arranged in advance, a piece of territory with limited actual value that would appear significant, a gift designed to relax the room. Voss accepted it too quickly. She saw it the moment it happened. Voss's shoulders dropped a fraction, the jaw loosened, something in his posture moved from performance into comfort. He leaned back. He reached for the water glass. He began to talk about the history of the Southwest Territory in a way that was longer than necessary, the way people talked when they were no longer worried about being interrupted and had started to enjoy the sound of their own authority. Crane's hand moved to the table surface. She leaned forward slightly in her chair and caught Lucian's eye. The prearranged signal, left hand dropping below the table level. Push. Now. Lucian said, "There's a secondary matter I'd like to address while we're here. The Meridian Corridor." The room changed. Not dramatically, not the way rooms changed in movies, with people jumping to their feet or voices rising. It changed the way a room changed when a weight shifted in the walls. A subtle structural alteration that everyone present felt in their body before they understood it consciously. Voss stopped talking mid-sentence. Crane's hand went flat on the table. Talia watched Crane's face with total attention. The neutral inventory expression remained. He was too controlled for anything as readable as surprise. But something moved behind his eyes, very fast, and she caught it before it was gone. He hadn't expected this. Crane had known this meeting might include maneuvering, but he hadn't anticipated Meridian, which meant either Lucian's mention of it was genuinely unexpected, or Crane had expected it to come from a different direction, and this direction meant something different to him than it should. She filed that. "The Meridian Corridor isn't part of this conversation," Voss said. His voice had changed, still flat, but there was something under the flatness now, a current of pressure. "It's adjacent to everything we've been discussing," Lucian said. "The Southwest Territory doesn't resolve cleanly without addressing what's happening in Meridian. I'd rather put it on the table while we're all here." Voss looked at him. "You want to talk about Meridian?" "I want to understand your position on it, yes." The silence lasted 4 seconds. She was watching Voss's hands. He had them flat on the table, the same position Crane's hands were in, but for different reasons. Where Crane's stillness was control, Voss's was the stillness of a person suppressing an impulse. Voss was angry. Not irritated, angry. The mention of Meridian had hit something specific. She needed to know what. She needed to know now, because Voss's anger was information, but it was also volatility. And volatility in this room had a cost she couldn't afford. She spoke. It was not part of the plan. Lucian had been explicit that she would not speak unless signaled. She spoke anyway. "Mr. Voss," she said. Every head in the room turned to her. Lucian's expression didn't move, but she felt the change in his attention, the sharp, focused alertness of a person watching someone do something unscripted and trying to assess in real time whether it's disaster or genius. Voss looked at her. "I thought you didn't speak." "I don't, usually." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm making an exception because I think it would be useful." The sheer straightforwardness of it seemed to catch him off guard. He had the quality of a man who was accustomed to people managing their language carefully around him, softening and angling, and directness at this volume read as either stupidity or confidence, and he wasn't sure which. "Useful to who?" he said. "To you," she said. "Can I show you something?" She reached into her bag, slowly, deliberately, keeping the motion visible, and produced a single sheet of paper. She'd prepared it the night before, a hand-drawn map, simple, showing the Southwest Territory in rough outline with the Meridian Corridor indicated at the eastern margin. She set it on the table in front of Voss. "The dispute you're discussing," she said, "is about this section here." She pointed to the southwest boundary. "But the pressure on that boundary exists because of what's happening here." She moved her finger east to the meridian marking. "Whatever meridian means to you, it's affecting how you're reading the Southwest situation. And I think if we could understand that connection, we could find a line on the map that actually holds, instead of one that has to be renegotiated in 4 months." Voss looked at the map. He looked at it for long enough that it meant something. She had gotten something right. She didn't know exactly what. She didn't have enough information about Meridian to know what specifically she'd triggered, but the map was working because it was concrete and visual, and it had given Voss something to look at instead of something to resist. People in positions of power, she had learned over years of watching them in the diner and everywhere else, were most comfortable when they could see the territory they were discussing. Abstract negotiation felt like vulnerability. Someone could tell you were wrong and you had nothing to point to. A map gave you ground, literally. Voss's finger moved to the southwest boundary. "This line here, this is wrong." "Show me where it should be," she said. She produced a pen and held it out to him across the table. He took it. She felt Crane go completely still. She didn't look at Crane. She kept her eyes on Voss, on his hand holding the pen, on the way he leaned over the map with something that was almost ordinary in it, a man looking at a problem he had a concrete opinion about, momentarily more interested in being right about the geography than in the performance of authority. He drew a line. It took him 40 seconds. He extended the southwest boundary further north than Lucian's current position and adjusted the eastern margin slightly. When he put the pen down, he looked up at Lucian with an expression that had lost some of its theater. "That," he said, "that's what we're actually talking about." Talia looked at the line. She looked at where it fell on the rough map relative to the meridian notation. The boundary Voss had drawn was smaller than what he'd been demanding verbally, significantly smaller. He had, in the process of being given a concrete object to respond to, revealed that his actual territorial need was a fraction of his stated position. She glanced at Lucian. He had seen it too. His expression was controlled, but his eyes were reading the map with the specific attention of a man recalculating. And then Crane's hand moved, not the small surface touch she'd been watching all evening. He reached into his jacket, and she heard, before she saw, the specific sound of a phone being produced. Except it wasn't a phone. The man near the door, one of Voss's men, stationed at the back wall, moved at exactly the same moment Crane's hand emerged, and the movement was wrong. Not the movement of a bodyguard reacting to a threat. The movement of a bodyguard receiving a signal. Everything in Talia's body registered it before her brain had assembled the explanation. She was on her feet. "We need to leave," she said to Lucian. Not a whisper, clear, direct, pitched exactly loud enough for him to hear it, and no louder. Lucian looked at her. 1 second. She held his gaze and gave him nothing except certainty. He stood up. Voss's face changed, the comfortable map-reading expression collapsing back into something harder and more defended. "We're not finished." "We've made significant progress," Lucian said. His voice was smooth, but he was already moving, pushing the chair back with controlled speed. "I'd like to take what we've discussed and formalize a proposal. We can reconvene." "Sit down," Voss said. The temperature of the word was different from everything he'd said before. Talia was moving now, not toward the door they'd come in, the staircase, the main exit, already closed in her mind, but toward the window at the north end of the room, where she'd noted the angle during the first minutes in the building. "Crane," Voss said. Crane had not moved from his seat. He was watching her. Not Lucian. Her. His expression had finally changed from neutral inventory into something more specific, the focused, assessing expression of someone who had just revised an estimate upward. "She knows," Crane said. His voice was quiet and even. He said it almost to himself. The man by the door took 3 steps toward the center of the room. Lucian was at her shoulder. She could feel him there, close, solid, and for the first time she was genuinely glad of his physical presence in a way that wasn't strategic. "North window," she said quietly. "Fire escape. It connects to the parking structure. It's 12 feet, 2nd floor. Do it." She crossed the room to the window and had the latch up before the man by the door reached the center of the table. The window opened outward. Cold air hit her face like a hard, flat hand. She looked down. Concrete landing, metal railing, connected to the structure's exterior walkway exactly as she'd calculated. She went out first. The landing caught her, and the metal rang under her feet, and the cold bit through the jacket, and she grabbed the railing and turned immediately to take Lucian's arm as he came through behind her. The window above them, she could hear voices, the particular compressed urgency of people reorganizing in a room that had gone sideways. "Move," she said. They moved. The walkway to the parking structure was 12 meters, and she covered it without slowing, Lucian 1 step behind her, the cold air filling her lungs and her legs working on something more fundamental than thought. The door to the structure was locked. She'd calculated this. She turned left along the external walkway toward the 2nd-level open deck of the structure, and they came out onto concrete open to the sky, cars ranked in rows, fluorescent lighting buzzing overhead. She had her phone out and was typing before her breath had fully caught. The text to Rourke. Crane signaled. "Voss men moving. We're in the parking structure east of the building." She stopped behind a concrete pillar at the structure's west edge and looked back at the building. The window they'd come through was dark, no one on the fire escape yet, but the ground-level exit on the building's south face had opened and a man had come out, moving fast and looking in the wrong direction. Lucian was breathing hard. Not from exertion, from something else, something she could hear underneath the physical effort. "How did you know?" he said. "Crane's hand," she said. He reached for something the same moment the man by the door moved. It was coordinated. They had a signal, and he used it. "That was a setup," Lucian said. The words came out flat, stripped of their usual management. The whole meeting was a... Voss requested this meeting to... "Not Voss," she said. "Crane." She looked at him. Voss didn't know. That's why Voss was actually negotiating. He thought it was real. The trap wasn't Voss's, it was Crane's. He used the meeting as cover. Lucian went very still. She gave him 4 seconds to process it and then said, "We need to move before they check the structure." Her phone vibrated. "Rourke. 2 cars. Give me 8 minutes." 8 minutes. She looked at her watch, looked at the structure's layout, ran a fast calculation. "Can you make it to the north exit of this structure?" she said to Lucian. "Yes." "Then we go now. We move slowly, not running, walking, normal pace in case there are cameras. And we're at the north sidewalk in 4 minutes, and we have 4 minutes to wait." "Slowly," Lucian repeated, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. She looked at him. In the buzzing fluorescent light of the parking structure, with the cold air and the distant sound of someone moving on the street below, Lucian Vale looked like what he actually was. A man who had been in dangerous situations for 20 years and had managed them through control and intelligence and the careful maintenance of position, and who had just had an evening demonstrate that his control had a limit, and that the limit was a man named Crane, whom he'd trusted for 14 months. "I know," she said. Not unkindly. He looked at her with that expression, the recalibrating one, and then something that wasn't quite gratitude but was adjacent to it moved across his face. "Slowly," she said again. "Come on." They walked. The north exit of the structure opened onto a side street that was quiet at this hour. A lone cyclist, a light from a late-closing restaurant 2 blocks east, the distant sound of a train. They reached the sidewalk with 3 minutes to spare and stood in the shadow of the structure's exterior wall and waited. She was cold. The jacket wasn't enough for standing still at this hour, and she was feeling it now that the movement had stopped. She was aware of her own heartbeat, not racing, but elevated, a steady hard knock that she could feel in her throat. Her hands were steady. She noticed that and was grateful for it. She was also, underneath the steadiness, something that wasn't quite anger, but lived next door to it. Crane had known she'd be there. He'd had her face from the photographs, had known Lucian was bringing her, and had used the meeting as an opportunity not for Voss, but for himself. The setup hadn't been designed to take out Lucian. Lucian was too useful as a visible player in the current structure. The setup had been designed to remove the variable, the unpredictable element, her. Crane had tried to remove her. Rourke's car, unmarked, dark blue, came around the corner at 7 minutes and 50 seconds. He pulled up to the curb and they got in, she in the back and Lucian in the front, and Rourke pulled away without being told to and drove north without asking where they were going. After 2 blocks, he said, "Both of you in one piece?" "Yes," she said. "What happened?" She told him. Precisely and in sequence, the way she'd told the police officers at the diner that night. Factually, no embellishment, the events in the order they'd occurred. She described Crane's signal and the door guard's movement and the specific coordination of it. She described Voss's expression at the moment Lucian stood up. The surprise, the anger, but underneath both of them a confusion that she was now certain was genuine. "Voss didn't plan it," she said. "He was negotiating. He drew the boundary on the map because he thought it was a real conversation. If this was Voss's trap, he wouldn't have given up ground on the territory. He had no reason to. Crane planned it and used Voss's meeting as cover without telling Voss." Rourke's hands were tight on the steering wheel. "Crane set up an ambush inside his own boss's meeting," Lucian said from the front seat. "Yes," she said, "which means Crane's timeline has accelerated. He's not waiting 60 to 90 days. Something changed." Rourke looked at her in the rearview mirror. "What changed it?" She held the look for a moment. "I think I did," she said. Moss told him a new analyst had been brought in with the ability to surface embedded information. Crane looked at that and decided it was a risk he couldn't let develop. He tried to remove me before I could learn anything else. The car was quiet for a moment. Outside, Chicago moved past in its ordinary nocturnal rhythm. Streetlights, storefronts, the occasional figure on a sidewalk moving through the cold. "He's going to try again," Rourke said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Which means we have less time than we thought." "Yes." She looked out the window. The adrenaline that had gotten her through the fire escape and across the parking structure was metabolizing now, leaving behind a specific exhausted clarity, the kind that came after the body had done something extreme and the mind was catching up to the cost of it. She was in this. Fully, irrevocably in this. The two photographs in Rourke's manila envelope had made her visible, and the conversation she'd walked into at the Ray meeting had made her relevant, and the moments in that second-floor conference room tonight had made her something that Silas Crane was willing to set a trap to remove. She thought about the map on the table, the line Voss had drawn, the simple, startling fact of a man being given something concrete to respond to and revealing, without intending to, that his real position was smaller and more defensible than everything he'd been performing. There was something there, not just in the tactical event, in the principle. Crane was performing too. The whole elaborate shadow organization, the parallel accounts, the careful positioning, it was all performance, in a sense. The performance of a man who was afraid that what he had wasn't enough and needed to build something separate to feel secure. And Voss had a secret. The Petrov documentation, the thing that Crane needed to survive and that Voss would burn everything to suppress. If both of them were afraid of the same thing, exposure, then the leverage wasn't in the territory or the money or the organizational structure. The leverage was the secret. She was still working through the shape of it when Rourke's phone rang. He answered it on the car's speaker without thinking, and the voice that came through the car's audio was one she didn't recognize. Male, tightly controlled, the syllables clipped in a way that meant the person on the other end was managing something difficult. "Rourke, we've got a problem." "I'm in the car, Tillman. What is it?" "Crane made a call 20 minutes ago. 3 calls, actually. The third one went to a number we've been tracking for 8 months. An operations coordinator we've been building a case around." "And?" A pause. "He called your precinct's main line at 11:14. He asked for you by name, left a message saying he had information about an ongoing operation and wanted to arrange a meeting." Rourke's jaw went hard. "He knows your name," Talia said from the back seat. "He's known my name," Rourke said tightly. "That's not what this is," she said. She was thinking fast now, the exhaustion pushed back by something sharper. "He didn't call to meet with you. He called to make a record of the contact. If Crane is documented as having reached out to you through official channels, it creates ambiguity about the nature of your relationship with this investigation." Silence in the car. Tillman's voice came back. "There's more. He faxed something to the precinct, a physical document sent to the records division. We don't know the content yet. The night staff logged it, but nobody's opened it." She felt it before she understood it fully. The document wasn't intelligence. It wasn't an offer. It was a weapon, and it had been sent before the meeting even ended, before Crane had given his signal, before the evening had played out, which meant Crane had prepared for multiple outcomes, and this was the one that covered his position regardless of whether the ambush had worked. "The document is about Rourke," she said. "His arrangement with Lucian. Evidence of it. Real, fabricated, or both. He's going to try to blow your cover before you can move on him." Rourke's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "If that document gets opened and processed," she said, "how much time do you have?" 48 hours, Rourke said. "Maybe less. Before internal affairs is involved and the investigation is frozen." "Then we have 48 hours, she said. "To do what?" Lucian said. He had turned in his seat to look at her directly. She looked back at him. She thought about Voss drawing the line on the map. The real boundary. Smaller, more honest. The thing beneath the performance. She thought about Crane's pale eyes in the photograph and in the conference room in the 8 months of careful shadow construction and the specific fear underneath all of it. She thought about the Petrov documentation in Lucian's possession and the 14 months Rourke had spent building towards something that was now 48 hours from being legally untouchable. She thought about a scared young man with a shotgun, shaking hands, the very specific quality of a person who was more frightened than anyone in the room he was trying to control. Crane was afraid. Voss was afraid. Rourke was 48 hours from losing 3 years of work, and she was the only person in the car who could see all 3 fears simultaneously. "We don't go to Crane," she said. "We go to Voss." Rourke stared at her in the rearview mirror. Voss didn't know about the trap tonight, she said. He was negotiating in good faith. Crane used his meeting without his knowledge to set an ambush inside his own organization. That is, she paused, finding the exact word. That is a betrayal. An active operational betrayal by Crane against Voss, right now, not in 60 days. Tonight. Lucian spoke slowly. You want to tell Voss what Crane did. I want to show him, with documentation, with the Petrov files. Because Crane knows about them, and Voss doesn't know that Crane knows. And when Voss understands that Crane has been building a position based on that knowledge for 8 months, the thing that destroys Voss's authority isn't the documentation itself. It's the fact that his most trusted man has been using it against him in private while performing loyalty in public. The car was very quiet. Voss needs to know that Crane set him up tonight, she said, not because we care about Voss, but because Voss, betrayed and cornered, with 48 hours before Crane's document gets processed, Voss in that state will do something decisive, something that gives Rourke what he's needed for 3 years, and that neutralizes Crane before Crane can finish what he started. She looked out the window. We can't stop Crane by fighting him directly. He's too prepared for that. But we can put him in a room with the one person whose fury he cannot predict and has not planned for. Lucian turned fully around in his seat. Rourke's eyes were on the road, but she could see from the angle of his head that he was listening with everything he had. You're going to walk into a room with Darius Voss, Lucian said. Tonight. After he just had an evening where we walked out of his meeting. Not his meeting, she said. Crane's. And Voss needs to know the difference. And if Voss doesn't see it that way, Rourke said carefully, if he decides the simplest explanation is that this is a play by Lucian to split his organization. She thought about the man who had leaned over a map and drawn a smaller boundary than anyone expected. The man who had been performing strength for 20 years, and who, when given something concrete and honest to respond to, had responded honestly, almost against his will. Then I'll put something in front of him that's more concrete than the alternative, she said, something he has to look at. She reached into the bag at her feet and produced the legal pad. 22 pages of notes, names, sequences, the financial architecture of Crane's parallel organization, the specific calls, the specific accounts, the timeline of preparation that Crane had been running while sitting at Voss's right hand. She held it up in the dim interior of the moving car. This is what Crane has been building, she said, every detail. And when Voss sees it, laid out in sequence, he will understand 2 things simultaneously, that his most trusted man has been planning to leave him in ruins, and that the woman sitting across from him spent 2 days reading through 14 months of his enemy's operations and is giving it to him anyway. Why would he trust you? Rourke said. Because I'm going to give him something real, she said. And Voss has been lied to by everyone around him for so long that real is the most disorienting thing I can put in front of him. The car moved north through the quiet city. She set the legal pad on her knee and looked at the pages, her own cramped handwriting, the names and numbers and sequences she'd assembled in 9 hours of reading and 2 days of thinking, the shape of a situation that had been moving toward this moment since a business card had appeared under her apartment door. She was not the same person who had opened that door and stood in the hallway looking at a man she didn't know. She wasn't sure yet exactly what she was instead, but she understood, sitting in the back of Rourke's unmarked car with the legal pad in her hands and 48 hours left on a clock she hadn't set, that the answer to that question was going to be determined not by what had happened to her, but by what she chose to do with it, and that the choosing, the actual clean act of deciding, was the only thing left in this entire situation that belonged entirely to her. She looked at the back of Lucian's head, at the side of Rourke's jaw. Call Voss, she said. Tell him we need to meet, tonight. Neither man argued. Voss picked up on the second ring. Lucian had the phone on speaker in the front seat, and the sound of Voss's voice filled the car, thick with something that was not quite anger and not quite surprise, but occupied the uneasy territory between them. You walked out of my meeting, Voss said. I walked out of Crane's meeting, Lucian said. That's what I need to talk to you about, tonight. A silence. 4 seconds. 5. You've got nerve, Voss said. I've got documentation, Lucian said, and I think you'll want to see it before tomorrow morning. Another silence. Talia was watching the back of Lucian's head, watching the specific stillness of a man holding a phone and understanding that the next 10 seconds would determine whether the next 48 hours were possible at all. Where? Voss said. Somewhere you choose, somewhere without Crane. The pause that followed was the longest one yet, 7 full seconds. And in that silence, Talia heard something she hadn't expected. Not suspicion, something more complicated than that. The particular silence of a man who has, somewhere beneath the armor of 20 years, been waiting for a specific sentence and had just heard it. Somewhere without Crane. I know a place, Voss said. 1 hour. Come alone. I'm bringing my analyst. The woman. Yes. A beat. Fine. 1 hour. The call ended. Rourke took a left and drove without being told where. Talia looked at the legal pad on her knee and thought about what she was about to do and what it required her to be. Not brave exactly, because bravery implied a choice made against fear, and what she felt right now wasn't fear so much as a cold, focused understanding of stakes. She was about to walk into a room with a man who had ordered killings, and she was going to put a stack of pages in front of him and ask him to read his own betrayal in the handwriting of a 24-year-old waitress. She straightened the pages. Rourke, she said, the document Crane faxed to the precinct. Can you delay it being processed? Legitimately? Is there a mechanism? Night intake. If something comes in past 11 and it's not flagged urgent, it gets batched for morning processing. It's 11:40. Yes. So it's in the batch. Unless someone flags it, or unless someone calls in and specifically requests it be pulled. She thought for a moment. Don't pull it. Leave it in the batch. If it gets processed in the morning, that's 48 hours from now. Maybe more. I need that window to be as wide as possible. And what happens inside that window? Rourke said. Voss deals with Crane, and then you deal with Voss. Rourke looked at her in the mirror again. She had noticed over the course of the evening that his mirror glances were different from ordinary driving checks. He used them the way she used peripheral vision, as a way of reading something without making the reading obvious. Voss isn't going to hand himself to me, Rourke said. Whatever we do tonight with Crane doesn't change Voss's exposure. No, she said. But Voss stepping down is different from Voss fighting. If his network fractures from the inside, if the operators around him see the infrastructure dissolving, the violence you're trying to prevent doesn't happen. And a man who steps down quietly because his organization has collapsed beneath him is a man you can build a case around at something closer to your own pace. You're asking me to accept a slower outcome. I'm asking you to accept a complete one, she said. You've been building this for 3 years. I'd rather give you something solid in a month than something rushed in 48 hours that falls apart in court. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then, in the tone of a man updating his assessment, you've thought about this for a while. Since the parking structure, she said, about 40 minutes. He didn't say anything else, but his hands loosened slightly on the steering wheel, and that was enough. The place Voss had chosen was a restaurant that had been closed for 2 hours. A family Italian place in Bridgeport, red-checked tablecloths and wine bottles on the windowsill. The kind of establishment that had been in one family long enough that closing time meant something flexible when certain people called. A man let them in through the side entrance without speaking. The dining room was dim, lit only by the kitchen pass-through light and 2 candles on the table in the far corner where Darius Voss was already sitting. He had a glass of red wine. There was no second glass. He hadn't poured for guests because he hadn't decided yet whether they were guests. Talia walked in behind Lucian, and she looked at Voss's face in the candlelight, and she saw something she hadn't expected to see in a man like him: exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of this evening, something older than that. The particular tiredness of a person who has maintained a performance for so long that they've forgotten what they were performing instead of, and some part of them has begun to understand the forgetting as a loss. Voss looked at her. Not at Lucian. At her first, which told her something about what had shifted in the car conversation. Sit down, he said. They sat. She put the legal pad on the table between them, but she didn't open it yet. She folded her hands over it and she looked at Voss directly, and she said, I want to tell you what happened tonight, not our interpretation of it. The sequence of events exactly as they occurred. Voss looked at the legal pad, then at her. Go ahead. She told him. The same way she'd told Rourke in the car, precisely, in sequence, without drama. She described Crane's hand movement and the door guard's coordinated response. She described the timing, that the signal had come before Lucian stood, before anything that could be read as provocation. She described the fact that at the moment Crane gave his signal, Voss had just drawn a boundary on a map in what had appeared to be genuine negotiation. Voss was very still as she spoke. Not the stillness of skepticism, the stillness of a man absorbing something that was reshaping the room around him in real time and choosing to let it reshape rather than fighting the process. When she finished, he said nothing for a long moment. He turned his wine glass once on the tablecloth, a slow rotation that seemed less like a gesture and more like something his hands were doing independently while the rest of him was elsewhere. "Crane's been with me 7 years," he said. "I know," she said. "He runs my operations, not the high-visibility things, the actual operations, the things that work and keep working. I know that too." "What you're telling me," Voss said slowly, "is that he tried to take you out, both of you, inside my meeting, using my men." "One of your men," she said. "The one by the door. I can't tell you whether he knew what he was part of or whether Crane told him something different." Voss's jaw moved. "Sayers. His name is Sayers." He said it quietly, like the name mattered, and he wasn't sure anymore what it mattered as. "I'm not here to tell you what to do about Sayers," she said. "That's not my business. What I'm here to tell you is what Crane has been building, and why he built it, and how long he's been building it." She opened the legal pad. She had organized it the night before in the order she'd want someone to read it, not chronologically, but architecturally, showing the structure first and then filling in the history. She turned the pad toward Voss and she walked him through it, page by page, pointing to the specific entries without letting him get lost in the volume. Account structures, relationship maps, the timing of Crane's external contacts relative to events in Voss's organization, the specific 8-month arc of construction. She watched Voss's face as he read. He was not a stupid man. She had known this before she walked in. Stupid men didn't survive 20 years in his position. But she saw it differently now, watching him process the pages. He read quickly, and he didn't ask clarifying questions, and the things his face did were not the things of a man being told a story, but of a man recognizing something he'd been looking at from the wrong angle. When he reached the page that laid out the Petrov connection, not the full documentation, but the outline of it, enough to show that Crane had known about it and had been using the knowledge as a structural element of his own planning. Voss's hand stopped moving on the tablecloth. "He knew about Petrov," Voss said. "For at least 8 months," she said. "Possibly longer." "How did he know?" "I don't know the original source, but the way he's positioned his alternative organization suggests he's been treating the Petrov exposure as a fixed horizon, a date by which he needs to be clear of your structure because he calculated that it would surface." Voss looked at the page for a long time. She let him look. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned, from the diner, from the Ray meeting, from the parking structure and everything before it, that silence was not emptiness. Silence was the space where people finish things, and interrupting it was the most reliable way to prevent completion. "He wasn't protecting me," Voss said finally. The words came out flat and slow, like they were being extracted rather than spoken. 7 years. Every time he told me he was managing a situation to protect the organization, he was managing it to protect himself, to make sure that when the time came, whatever fell would fall on me. She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. Voss pushed the legal pad back across the table toward her. He picked up his wine glass and set it down again without drinking from it. "What do you want from me?" he said. "I want you to understand," she said, "that the document Crane sent to the police precinct tonight, the one designed to compromise the detective who's been investigating your organization, was not sent to protect you. It was sent to protect Crane's timeline. If Rourke's investigation gets frozen, Crane has the window he needs to complete his transition. You become the thing that absorbs the legal consequence while Crane operates freely with the organization he's built alongside yours." Voss looked at her. His eyes in the candlelight were dark and very old. "You're telling me," he said carefully, "that I'm the decoy." You've been the decoy for 8 months, she said. "You just didn't know it." The silence that followed was different from the others. It had a different weight, the weight of something being set down that had been carried for a long time without the carrier knowing they were carrying it. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to feel something when this moment arrived, but what she actually felt was something much closer to sorrow. The specific, unavoidable sorrow of watching a person understand that they have been profoundly alone in a situation they believed they were navigating together. She understood that feeling. She understood it in a way she hadn't fully articulated even to herself until this moment, in a dim Italian restaurant with a candle burning between her and a man who had done terrible things, and was now sitting with the knowledge that his most trusted instrument had been sharpened against him. Voss set his hands flat on the table. "The Petrov documentation," he said. "Where is it?" "With Lucian," she said. "What does he want for it?" "Nothing," Lucian said. He had been quiet for the duration. Deliberately, she knew, because she'd asked him to be. He spoke now from the chair beside her. "I'm not using it as leverage. If I were using it as leverage, I'd have used it 8 months ago." "Then why do you have it?" Voss said. "Because I needed to understand what Crane knew," Lucian said, "and the documentation told me what Crane was protecting, which told me what Crane was planning." Voss looked between them. The calculation in his face was not the calculation of a man deciding whether to trust. Trust, she suspected, was not a concept Voss operated from in any pure sense. It was the calculation of a man assessing the geometry of his available positions and identifying which one left him with something. "What does the detective want?" Voss said. She was the one who answered. "He wants the network to stop, not testimony. He's not asking you to testify against anyone. He wants the violence to end and the operation to wind down. If that happens voluntarily and completely, the approach to the prosecution looks different. Different how? Slower, more careful, focused on the things that can actually be proven rather than on building a case through connections that might not hold." Voss was quiet. "He's been building against you for 3 years," she said. "He has enough to cause significant damage, but he doesn't have the clean case he wanted, and a damaged prosecution is worse for him professionally than a delayed one. What he needs is for the violence to stop and the operation to wind down in a way that doesn't leave a vacuum that 4 other organizations move to fill simultaneously." "So he wants a controlled dissolution," Voss said. "Yes, and in exchange. He pulls the document Crane sent. It doesn't get processed. Crane loses his window." Voss's eyes narrowed slightly. "Crane loses his window and he still has an organization. He has an organization that depends on infrastructure you currently control," she said. "If your operation winds down in a controlled way, Crane's shadow structure loses its foundation. The accounts work because they're built alongside your operation. Separate accounts, separate relationships, but embedded in the same territory. Take the territory out from under it, and the accounts are just money sitting in places that no longer have operational meaning." She watched him absorb this. "You want me to step down," he said. "And by stepping down, I collapse Crane's structure at the same time. I want you to understand that stepping down is the one action Crane cannot have planned for," she said. "He planned for you to stay and fight and eventually fall under legal pressure. He planned for you to be removed by force. He planned for Rourke's investigation to continue long enough to give him coverage. The one thing he did not plan for is you making a decision that he cannot counter." Voss looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze. The candle between them had burned down during the conversation and was now guttering in its own pooled wax. In the kitchen, someone had turned off the pass-through light, and the room was dimmer than it had been when they'd arrived. The restaurant smelled like garlic and old wood and something sweet from the dessert case near the door. "You're 20-something years old," Voss said. 24, she said. "And you walk into my restaurant and you tell me to step down from everything I've built." "I tell you that stepping down is the only move Crane can't survive," she said. "What you do with that is yours." A long silence. "I want the Petrov documentation," Voss said. "Not to use it, to have it. If I'm making this kind of decision, I need to know what's actually in it." She looked at Lucian. Lucian reached into his jacket and produced a folded envelope. She hadn't known he'd brought it, hadn't asked, and set it on the table between them. "It's all there," he said. "Everything." Voss looked at the envelope. He didn't pick it up immediately. He sat with it, sitting in front of him for a long moment, the way a person sat with something they knew would change the inside of them once they opened it and were taking a last moment in the space before that change. Then he picked it up and put it in his jacket. "I'll need 2 weeks," he said. "You have 48 hours before the document gets processed," she said. "After that, the window may not be controllable. 2 weeks for a full controlled dissolution. 48 hours I can use to pull Crane's legs out." He looked at Lucian. The accounts Crane has been building. Your financial people know where to look now? After tonight? Yes. I can make some of that accessible. Not all of it. Some of it will take time, but enough to demonstrate good faith to your detective. He said the words good faith the way a person said words in a language they'd learned as adults, correctly, but with a faint consciousness of the learning. She looked at Rourke. She realized, with a minor shock, that she'd been constructing the conversation as if he were present, as if she could read the acceptability of each term in his response. But he was in the car outside, and she was here alone with these two men and the decisions she'd made in the last 40 minutes, and the 22 pages of notes that were her only collateral. I'll relay the terms, she said, but I can't promise his answer. No, Voss said. I expect not. He picked up his wine glass again, and this time he drank from it, a short, deliberate swallow. Tell him I'm aware of what I'm offering. I'm not doing this because I've developed a conscience. I'm doing it because the alternative is letting Crane use me as a mattress to land on, and that— He paused. Something moved through his face that she didn't have a name for. That I will not do. She stood up. Lucian stood with her. At the door, Voss's voice came from behind them. The woman, Monroe. She turned. You knew when you walked in here tonight that I might not respond the way you needed me to, he said. You knew I might take the documentation and have both of you removed before you reached the car. Yes, she said. And you came anyway. The alternative, she said, was letting Crane use everyone in this situation as a mattress to land on, including my father. She paused. I had the same reason you do. Turns out it's a fairly common one. Voss looked at her for a long moment. His face did not do anything as readable as respect. It did something more complicated, something in the region of recognition. She walked out. The night air hit her face, and she stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, and breathed in and breathed out, and the cold filled her lungs, and she stood there long enough to let the inside of her chest settle into something approaching equilibrium. Lucian came out behind her. He stood beside her without speaking for a moment. That was not the plan, he said. No. The part about your father, you hadn't mentioned that to me. It was relevant, she said, and it was true. He was quiet for a moment. Both things can be true simultaneously. Yes, she said. They can. They walked to the car. Rourke listened to the terms without interrupting. When she finished, he sat with his hands on the wheel and the engine running and the heater making its low sound, and he didn't speak for almost 30 seconds. Then he said, 2 weeks. With the account access as good faith in the first 48 hours. And Crane. Boss will pull Crane's foundation. He knows his own operation better than either of us. He knows which pieces, removed, make Crane's shadow structure unsustainable. And the document at the precinct needs to stay in the batch. Not flagged. Give the 2 weeks. Another long silence. If Voss doesn't hold to it, Rourke said. Then you're in the same position you were in this morning, she said. Nothing you have right now gets worse if this doesn't work. Rourke looked at his hands on the wheel. She could see in the set of his shoulders the specific weight of 3 years, the accumulation of case files and surveillance hours and compromised informants, and the slow, grinding frustration of building something careful in a world that kept moving faster than the building. All right, he said. 2 weeks. She let out a breath she hadn't noticed she was holding. They drove in silence for a while. The city moved past the windows in its ordinary way. The same city it had always been, the same lit windows and late buses and people moving through their private orbits. She looked at it, and it looked back at her, and it seemed, for the first time in several days, like something she recognized. Rourke dropped Lucian first, a building in the West Loop, a door that opened before Lucian reached it because someone inside had been watching. Lucian got out and then turned back and looked at Talia through the open car door. I'll have the contract documentation to you by morning, he said. Not the original terms, new terms. She looked at him. I haven't said I'm continuing. I know, he said. The documentation will be there regardless. He closed the door. She rode in the back of Rourke's car through the quiet city, and she looked out the window and she thought about new terms. Rourke stopped 2 blocks from her building. She understood why. He couldn't be seen dropping her at her door, not tonight, not given the remaining shape of things. She got out and then paused with the door open. Rourke, she said. He looked at her in the mirror. The person in your unit who leaked to Crane, she said. You know who it is? A pause. I have a strong suspicion. But you can't move on it yet. Not until the 48 hours clear and the document gets processed without action. If I move now, it confirms the leak exists and Crane has warning. She nodded. After the 2 weeks, when Voss's dissolution is visible enough to be verifiable, that's when you move on your unit. Yes. She stood with the cold air coming in through the open door and the city quiet around them. You've been doing this a long time, she said. 14 years. Does it get easier? The part where you have to wait when you know. Rourke was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice had a different quality than it had had at any other point in the evening. Less managed, something more directly itself. No, he said. But you get better at understanding why the waiting is the job. Most of it, anyway. She closed the door. She walked the 2 blocks home. The building's front door lock was still broken. It had been broken since February and would probably be broken in February of the following year, and this was simply a fact of where she lived. She walked up the 3 flights and unlocked her apartment door and went inside. Sargent was on the kitchen counter. He looked at her with his one eye and made a sound that was not quite a meow, more of a compressed assessment. And then he sat down. I know, she said. 3rd time. But this one felt different from the first 2. She sat on the floor with her back against the couch, the same position she'd been in the night she'd made the decision on the phone with Lucian, and she held the folded piece of paper, the debt documentation, in her hands, and she looked at it. The debt of Calvin Monroe in full is hereby discharged. All claims are abandoned. Effective. Thursday, December 4th. She folded it again, put it on the coffee table. She sat for a while in the quiet apartment, and she didn't think about Crane or Voss or Rourke or the 48 hours or the 2 weeks. She thought about her father, Calvin Monroe, who would wake up tomorrow morning and make coffee and watch the news for 45 seconds before turning it off, and who did not know that the weight he'd been carrying for 3 years had been lifted from him tonight in a dim Italian restaurant by his daughter and a crime boss who'd reached the limit of being used. She would tell him. Not all of it, not the parts that would frighten him or the parts that were not hers to share, but enough. She would tell him enough so that he knew it was done, and so that the specific quality of worry she'd heard under his cheerfulness every time they'd spoken for the last 3 years could stop being the thing underneath the thing. She picked up her phone. It was almost 1 in the morning. She should wait until morning. She called anyway. He picked up on the 2nd ring. Talia? Everything okay? Everything's okay, Dad. She paused. I needed to tell you something. At 1 in the morning. Yeah. That's your mother's timing, he said, and she could hear the smile in it. The debt, she said, the money you owe. It's handled. You don't owe anything anymore, and no one is going to come looking for it. A long silence. Talia, I don't need you to ask how, she said. I'll explain what I can when I see you. I just needed you to know tonight. Another silence. Longer. She heard something on the other end that she was willing to identify as the sound of a person who had been underwater for a long time and had just broken the surface. You okay? He said. His voice was different now. The cheerfulness gone, something more real in its place. The voice of the man underneath the man who made people laugh at dinner tables. Yeah, she said. I'm okay. You sure? I'm sure. She heard him breathe in and out, once. I'm going to want to know, he said. Eventually. All of it. I know. I'll tell you. Okay. A pause. Get some sleep, sweetheart. You too. She hung up. She sat on the floor for another few minutes, and then she stood up and went to bed, and she slept, this time for 8 hours straight, the longest she'd slept in a week. And she didn't dream at all. The next 10 days were not clean. She had not expected them to be clean, but the specific texture of their difficulty was different from what she'd anticipated. It was not dramatic. No more parking structures, no more fire escapes, no confrontations in dim rooms. It was paperwork and waiting and the specific tension of a situation that was moving but could not be observed moving, the way you could not watch a plant grow by staring at it. Rourke called her twice a day. Brief calls. Updates without content. Mostly, the coded shorthand of a person confirming a process without saying what the process was over an insecure line. She learned to read his tone rather than his words. The first 4 days, his tone was the controlled tension of someone waiting for the first sign. On the fifth day, something shifted, a loosening in the brevity of the call, a quality that meant something had confirmed. Crane's accounts, she learned later, had begun to show irregularities, not the kind that Crane had introduced deliberately. The opposite. Money that had been sitting in the parallel structure, waiting for the transition, had started behaving in ways that suggested the foundation underneath it was no longer stable. Voss, it turned out, knew his own operation with a specificity that no outside assessment could have replicated. He pulled the right threads in the right sequence, and what Crane had spent 8 months building began to show the structural vulnerabilities of something that had been built alongside something else, rather than freestanding. Crane moved. Of course he did. He was too intelligent to sit still when his ground was shifting. He made 2 approaches. One to an operator in Voss's organization who might have been sympathetic, and one to a financial contact who had been part of the parallel structure. Both approaches were documented. Both people, it turned out, had already decided that their safest position was distance. Crane's transition was not possible on his timeline anymore. On the 9th day, Rourke called at 7 in the morning. "It's visible enough," he said. She understood. "Okay. I'm moving on my unit this afternoon." She didn't ask who. She would find out eventually, or she wouldn't, and either way it was Rourke's responsibility and not hers to carry. "And Crane?" she said. "Crane resigned from the Voss organization this morning. Formally. As much as anything in that world is formal. He put distance between himself and the structure that's being wound down." "Smart," she said, without admiration. "Just acknowledgement." "Smart," Rourke agreed, "but the account irregularities are documented, and the contacts he made during the transition attempt are documented, and what he sent to the precinct is documented. Building a case is slower than I wanted, but it's solid." "Slower is solid," she said. "Yes." A pause. "Monroe." "Yeah." "What you did on Thursday night. The restaurant." She waited. "You had no guarantee Voss would respond the way he did," Rourke said. "You went in there with a legal pad and an argument and a calculated read on a man you'd met once across a negotiation table." "That's accurate," she said. "I need you to understand that I wouldn't have approved that approach if you'd asked me beforehand." "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't ask." A pause. She heard something in his silence that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same neighborhood. "Fair enough," he said. He hung up. Voss stepped down formally at the end of the second week. Not publicly. There was no public to step down to, no press conference, no announcement. The stepping down was visible in a series of operational facts. Accounts restructured, personnel redistributed, territorial arrangements wound back to boundaries that had not been contested. Several men who had been associated with the more violent aspects of the operation found themselves without positions, and absent the organizational infrastructure that had protected them, became visible to law enforcement in ways they hadn't been before. 4 arrests in the 3rd week, 2 more in the 4th. Garrett Moss, she learned from Lucian, had been removed from the organization before any of the rest of it, quietly, efficiently, with the particular finality that Lucian operated with when he was certain of something. She didn't ask what removed meant. She suspected she knew, and she had made a decision early in this process about which things she would carry and which things she would leave to the people who had chosen to carry them. Dennis Ray, the man from the first meeting, was a different story. The Meridian account irregularity, real, as it turned out, became part of a separate financial investigation that Rourke was not involved in. She followed it at a distance and decided she'd done what she'd done, and the consequences were what they were. On the Thursday of the 3rd week, exactly 2 weeks after the Italian restaurant, she went to see her father. Calvin Monroe's house on the northwest side was a 2-story frame house that had needed a coat of paint for at least 4 years, and had a yard that was immaculately maintained because Calvin had decided that if the outside of the structure was beyond him, the least he could do was handle the grass. She pulled into the driveway in a car she'd borrowed from a neighbor and sat for a moment before going in. He was waiting at the door. He'd seen her pull up. He always watched from the front window when he was expecting someone, had done it her whole life, this small surveillance of arrival that was his version of welcome. He looked like himself. She had been afraid, without admitting the fear, that she would arrive and he would look reduced somehow. that the weight of the debt and its sudden absence would have left a visible mark. But he looked like Calvin Monroe, a little heavier than he should be, with the reading glasses pushed up on his head that he always forgot about, and the expression of a man genuinely glad to see someone. She hugged him at the door, which was not something she did often because she'd learned her emotional restraint from his side of the family, and it had calcified into habit over the years. He hugged her back harder than she'd expected. Inside, they sat at the kitchen table. He made coffee the way he always made it, too strong, in a pot that had needed replacing for 2 years. She drank it and held the mug in both hands and let the warmth get into her fingers. She told him what she could. She told him about Lucian's offer and the terms she'd set. She told him about the 3 meetings, the first, the second, the Bridgeport building. She did not tell him about the fire escape or the parking structure. She told him about the restaurant. She told him that the men who had held his debt were no longer in any position to collect it, and that the documentation confirming the erasure existed and was in her possession. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. He held his coffee cup and he listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You did all of this," he said, "for me." "I did it because it needed doing," she said, "and because I could." "Talia, Dad." She looked at him. "I'm not angry. I want you to know that specifically. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel guilty. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what happened, and because—" She paused, finding the right thing. "Because I spent a long time thinking I was just getting through. That getting through was enough, and this changed that. So it wasn't only for you, it was for me too." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were doing something she recognized. The thing behind the cheerfulness. The thing that was more himself than the public version of himself that made everyone laugh at dinner tables. "Your mother," he said, "would have done exactly what you did." She looked at her coffee cup. "I know," she said. "I'm starting to understand that." They sat in the kitchen for another hour. He told her about his neighbor's tomatoes. They'd apparently reached a truce over the fence line, and about a documentary he'd watched about deep-sea creatures, and about a cousin she'd never met who had apparently turned up alive after 15 years on a sheep farm in New Zealand. She listened to all of it. She laughed at the parts that were funny, which were most of them, because Calvin Monroe at his best was a genuinely funny man, and she had not been laughing enough in the past several weeks. When she stood to leave, he followed her to the door. "This work you're doing," he said, "this thing with Vale, are you going to keep doing it?" She'd been thinking about the answer to this question for 3 weeks, and she still wasn't certain she had it. "Maybe," she said, "differently than before." "What does differently mean?" "It means I set the terms," she said. "Not because it's offered to me, but because I negotiate it. My own attorney, my own contract, the right to walk away from anything that crosses a line I set." And Vale agreed to that. "He will," she said, "when I present it." Her father looked at her in the doorway. The afternoon light was behind her, the cold, clean light of early December, and he stood in his warm kitchen that smelled like coffee and old wood and too strong paint, and he looked at his daughter. "You're different," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think so." "Is it a good different?" She thought about it. Honestly, the way she was trying to do everything now, not rushing to the comfortable answer, not smoothing the thing over. "I think it's a true different," she said. "I'll let you know about good." He smiled, the real one, not the dinner party one. "That's fair?" She drove back through the city. The attorney she hired was a woman named Patricia Chen, who had an office in the Loop, and who came recommended by a contact she'd made through Rourke. Not a friend of Rourke's exactly, but a person who existed at the intersection of the legal and extra-legal worlds, and who knew what a contract in this context needed to contain. Patricia Chen listened to what Talia described without visible surprise and asked 12 precise questions and said she'd have a draft in 5 business days. 5 business days later, Talia sat across from Lucian Vale in his office on Fulton Street, the same plain room with the whiteboard and the window looking onto the alley, and she put the contract on the table between them. He picked it up and read it. He read it carefully, all of it, without rushing, which she had expected because Lucian Vale did not rush anything that mattered. When he finished, he set it down. "Independent protection," he said. "My own security. Accountable to me, not to your organization. Full transparency," he said. No selective information, no partial context. Everything you know that's relevant to a situation I'm walking into, I know before I walk in. The right to leave, he said. Any situation that violates the moral parameters specified in Section 4, she said. Non-negotiable, no discussion, effective immediately. And fair compensation, he said. Patricia said a number. It's in Section 7. He looked at Section 7. Something moved through his expression. Not shock, but a recalibration of the kind she'd seen on his face several times now, the small updating of an assessment. That's a significant number, he said. It's a number that reflects what I actually bring to the situations I walk into, she said. If you disagree, we're done before we start. He looked at the contract for another moment. Then he picked up a pen from the desk. He signed it. She signed it. Patricia Chen countersigned by notarization the following morning because Patricia Chen was thorough and the contract became the thing it was. Not legally binding in any court that would acknowledge its full context, but specific enough and witnessed enough and documented enough that both parties understood exactly what it meant to violate it. She did not go back to the diner. She had considered finishing out the week, saying goodbye to Marco and Danny and the regulars who came in on Tuesday nights. But she understood, sitting with the idea, that going back was a different thing from leaving properly, and that the proper leaving had already happened on the night she'd handed the keys to Danny and walked out into the cold morning. She called Danny and told him she wouldn't be coming back. He said he'd figured. He said she'd always been too good at the coffee anyway, that it had made the other girls look bad. And she laughed and said goodbye, and that was that. She kept one thing from the diner. Not her uniform, not the order pad she'd been using for 5 years. She kept the pen she'd had in her apron pocket on the night of the robbery. An ordinary pen, the kind that came in multi-packs, that she'd been using when the bell above the door rang and 3 men came in with their hands covered and their intentions clear. She kept it because it was the thing that had been in her hand when she'd understood what she was, and that seemed worth keeping. The business card, the one that had started everything, she kept too. Lucian Vale. You're wasted. She kept it in the small bowl by her front door where she kept her keys, and she saw it every time she left and every time she came home. And what it meant to her shifted over the weeks and months that followed until it meant something she hadn't expected when she'd first turned it over in the kitchen light. It didn't mean his discovery of her. It didn't mean his assessment of her value, or the moment she'd entered his world, or any of the things it might have meant if she'd been a different kind of person. It meant the moment she'd stopped agreeing. She had spent 24 years agreeing with the version of herself that the world reflected back at her. Invisible, efficient, competent in small spaces, useful in the gaps, getting through. The card did not change that. What changed it was what she'd done after. The choices in sequence, the meetings, and the parking structures, and the Italian restaurant, the decision to walk into a room with Darius Voss at midnight with nothing but 22 pages of cramped handwriting and an accurate read on what a betrayed man needed to hear. The card just marked the beginning of the agreement changing. She kept it. Sargent knocked it off the bowl twice in the first month, and she put it back both times. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the contract, 5 weeks after the robbery, she woke up at 6 and made coffee the right strength and stood in her kitchen in the early light and looked at the street below. The city was doing its morning shift, the delivery trucks and the early walkers, and the particular gray-gold quality of December light on concrete. She thought about the young man with the shotgun. She'd thought about him intermittently over the 5 weeks, and she'd come to no conclusions about him except the ones she'd already reached that night. That he'd been afraid, that the fear was driving the choices, that underneath the performance of menace was a person who had not planned well for what doing this would actually feel like. She hoped he hadn't done it again. She didn't know if that was likely, and she acknowledged that she didn't know. She finished her coffee. She put on her coat, the good one, the one she'd bought with the first month's payment under the new contract, which was warm enough for December in a way her previous coat had never been. And she picked up her keys from the bowl. She looked at the card. You're wasted. She touched it once with 2 fingers, not picking it up, just contact, just acknowledgement. And then she took her keys and walked out the door. The city was cold and bright and loud and entirely itself, and she walked into it with her hands in her pockets and her eyes open, reading everything, missing nothing, carrying the weight of what she'd learned and what she'd chosen, and where she was going and who she was going there as, and none of it was simple or clean or finished. But it was hers. That, she had decided, was enough to start with.